Okay, thank you, Cameron, and welcome everybody. And as I understand, Cameron, that if they don't join the Foreign Trade Association, they don't get lunch today? No lunch. Okay, okay, so just a little inducement there, or threat. Okay, come on in, folks. According to the schedule or the program today, I'm to do panel introduction. I'm going to make those brief, and instead, executive decision here. As each speaker comes up, we'll give you a little bit more detail on who they are and what they do and where they've been. And okay, just in order that of the speaking engagements here, our first speaker will be David Harlow, and he's president and CEO of ITC Diligence. The next speaker will be Senior CBP Officer Owen Teruya of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Next, we'll have Stu Spikerman, and he's president of TriLink Inc. And if you're wondering what these companies are and what they do, detail to follow. Next will be Michael Schenk, Customs and Logistics Specialist for Yokohama Tire. And we think we got everybody here. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. And according to the schedule, we're going to do FTZ overview and process. I'll just start out with a war story, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Harlow to go into a whole lot more detail. But one of my introductions to foreign trade zones, and perhaps to give you an idea of what can be done in a foreign trade zone, back in the 1990s, I was working at Hughes Aircraft, and we had launched a satellite in beautiful French Guiana, and maybe that'll be a test for everybody. Where in the heck is French Guiana, and why they launch satellites there? But we can talk a break about that. Okay. But anyway, we sent a bunch of material over to French Guiana to support the launch temporarily. It was all on a Department of State ITAR license, a DSP 73 temporary export license, which is a license to export and re-import. And we successfully launched the satellite. Then we loaded up all the leftover stuff, put it on a charter flight, and chartered a plane, landed at LAX. And on the way, we realized that the license had expired, and we had no license to re-import all that material. So now what do? We got a plane full of stuff. It landed at LAX, required a license to re-import. We had no license. We had a renewal application in the works, but State Department doesn't move very rapidly on these things, and so we had to wait for the new license replacement to be approved. What do? What we did is we moved it all down to Foreign Trade Zone 50 in beautiful Wilmington, California. But before that happened, I went down to Foreign Trade Zone 50 to see what the place was like and where we could put our stuff and that kind of stuff. And they gave me a little tour of the place. And the first thing they took me to go see is over in one section of the zone, here was a company was working on copper anode plates out of some generating plant or whatever. What were they doing? Recovering copper from the plates. And then went to the next part of the zone, and here are a bunch of aluminum car wheels that you can, aftermarket wheels you can buy for your car. And what had happened is the wheels were not marked with the country of origin. So they put them in the zone, and here was a crew, an engraving crew was engraving every wheel made in Pakistan. And as soon as they finished engraving all the wheels, they could then take them out of the zone and file an entry on them and go out and sell them. Next part of the zone were pallet after pallet of wheat gluten. I guess that was before gluten became a bad thing. And anyway, gluten was so popular, it was subject to an import quota. And what had happened is somebody had imported all these pallets full of wheat gluten, and the quota was full. So what do you do with stuff that's where the quota is full? They put them in the foreign trade zone. And here they were just sitting in the zone, waiting for the quota to reopen. And as soon as it reopened, they're going to be Johnny on the spot and file an entry on it while the quota is open and have their wheat gluten and go out and sell it for lots of money to people who aren't on low wheat gluten diets. And then perhaps the neatest thing I saw in the zone was one part of the zone is all fenced off, and here are about 30 Lamborghini sports cars sitting in a foreign trade zone. What had happened is they imported the cars, but the engines did not meet EPA requirements. So they put the the sports cars in the zone, and the plan was to fly in 30 compliant V12 engines, take the non-compliant engines out of the cars, send them back to Italy, and then put the compliant engines in the cars and drive them out of the zone. So what you've seen here are different ways you can use the zone. We were using the zone because we didn't have a license to import the stuff and waiting for the license to be approved. When it was, we took the stuff out of the zone. A copper smelting operation was going on, recovery operation was going on there. Articles not legally marked to the country of origin, put those in the zone. Items that are subject to quota, and the quota's full, they put those in the zone, and items not meeting EPA requirements, put them in the zone. So right there, great illustration of a number of things that you can do in a foreign trade zone, but I think that's only an introduction. As you're going to find out today, you could do a lot more things in the zone, and there are a lot of advantages to that. And with that, I'm going to turn next to David Harlow. Let me do a little more introduction here. Put on the specs. His company was founded in 2002 as an international trade consulting firm and a second-generation national corporate custom house broker. Okay, so do both. Okay, ITC provides a unique blend of international trade-related services to importers, exporters, manufacturers, distributors, public utilities, and local government, focusing on customs and border protection in the foreign trade zones. Okay, Mr. Harlow represents 4 of the 9 grantees in Southern California. What in the heck is a grantee? More of that to follow. Okay, and assists regions, cities, and businesses with the implementation and oversight of the Foreign Trade Zone program. In addition, his company provides services in 8 different states while continuing to grow. Okay, Mr. Harlow is a California native. Good. All right. Received his customs broker's license 2004. You passed the exam right, and they got your fingerprints right and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Spent the last 10 years specializing in the textile industry. Well, you go for the easy stuff, right? Okay. Footwear industry, there's another easy one. And foreign trade zone industry, there's the final challenge. Began his career. This is a test to see how many of you remember these outfits. Fritz Companies, worked for Fritz Companies and Norman Krieger, Inc. Spends his free time actively participating in the Los Angeles Small Business Commission, the Brokers Association, National Association of Foreign Trade Zones, IVEDC. What? I'm not familiar with that acronym.
Imperial Valley Economic Development Corporation.
Do you live out that direction?
No, I don't.
Okay,
but we do a lot of business out there.
Okay. And the SC, Southern California Foreign Trade Zones. Most importantly, he spends time with his wife, Dawn, and 3 children. So, David, take it from here.
Thank you very much. By the way, one association that's not added on that bio that will be added today is a member of the FTA. Because I want lunch.
All right.
So anyways.
You got your mic on, by the way?
Yeah, I have the.
Okay, good.
Everyone can hear me fine? So again, my goal here today with my presentation is to talk about the foreign trade zone, the benefits that it offers, how the program works, what are some of the creative ways to maximize your benefits using the program, and understand the hierarchy within the foreign trade zone program so you understand how everything works and how you can maximize those benefits. Probably the best way to describe a foreign trade zone would be a duty-free island. This is a company or a warehouse, a facility that's located physically here in the United States that allows you to do a number of different things, such as storing domestic goods, storing foreign goods, manufacturing those goods, manipulating those goods, destroying those goods, and exhibiting those goods. All of this can be done in a facility that's outside customs jurisdiction and outside the commerce of the U.S. These are key terms that allow a lot of the great things you can do in a foreign trade zone to be done because of those circumstances. Again, there is no limitation to how long those goods can be in the foreign trade zone, and there are no limitations to how you store those goods other than being able to identify those goods. So you don't need to keep one half of your warehouse with domestic goods and the other half of your warehouse with foreign goods. As long as you properly label and identify the goods, you can commingle those goods and you can store those goods to make your warehouses as efficient as possible. These are some of the unique differences you'll see with bonded warehouses, where you're very limited on what you can do with your goods in a bonded warehouse and how you can store those goods. And again, in a bonded warehouse, you're not allowed to use bring domestic goods into your bonded warehouse. So there's definitely some advantages there. First, let's understand where the program came from here in Southern California. FTZ 50 and FTZ 202 are the first foreign trade zones here in Southern California that represent this program. But you've noticed, as you can see on this map, that most of the foreign trade zones do seem to align with the Alameda corridor and the NAFTA corridor. The reason for this is these are our distribution lanes for moving goods across the country. Foreign trade zones do not need to stay within the port. They can actually expand along those distribution lanes for manufacturing and distribution around the country. So foreign trade zones are very, give you that advantage to be able to expand where you're located and expand how you use the program with U.S. Customs.
Those trucks were moving right along on the illustration. So
Yes.
I guess they were not on the 405.
No, they weren't.
Okay.
But it's important to understand where the program came from. The program was actually established in 1934. It was part of the New Deal Act to combat the Great Depression. President Roosevelt signed it into law, where the goal was to help create and retain jobs, to help promote international trade, and then also to help stimulate the economy. The great thing about this program is, for all the needs and reasons for having the program in 1934, it's even more important to have this program in 2017, simply because we're not just a U.S. economy, but we're part of the global economy. We're moving goods across the world to consumers all over the world, and the foreign trade zone gives us that alternative solution to be able to manage that more effectively. So the foreign trade zone definitely is here to create good things and positive things here in the United States and for importers and exporters. So what are some of the different industries that benefit from the foreign trade zone? I've listed here the top 10 industries that tend to see the biggest benefit of the program, simply because these are industries that have high value goods, are heavily regulated by the U.S. government, or have high volume product. So for example, textiles and wearing apparel has high duty rates that usually float around 30%. Alcohol has a very high tax rate that can be as high as 80%. Pharmaceutical companies, oil refineries are heavily regulated by the U.S. government, so the foreign trade zones offers a lot of benefits for these types of industries. But it's important to understand that literally every industry in this country can benefit from the foreign trade zone as long as it meets one common denominator, which is it has to import something into the United States first, whether that's a raw material, component, or finished good. Once you import that product, you're now eligible to potentially benefit from the foreign trade zone. Obviously, if I'm importing toys that have low value and are duty-free, those benefits are going to be minimal compared to importing alcohol or textiles or pharmaceuticals, where those duty rates are very high, the value of those goods are very high, and they can also be heavily regulated. But every industry can benefit from the program. To give you an example, is why would a toy industry or a toy company that imports toys into the United States ever want to use the foreign trade zone if their value is extremely low and their duty rate on all toys is free? But many companies will import goods into the United States and use the United States as a distribution of moving those goods to other places like Canada and Mexico. If I bring toys into the United States and I clear them in the United States, I'm not going to pay any duty, but I'm subject to other government agency requirements that my toys may not meet in the U.S., but they do meet, for example, in Mexico or Canada. So my toys were made to meet those requirements because I'm going to sell them in Mexico and Canada. I'm not going to sell them in the United States. So to avoid having to meet the requirements in the U.S., since they're never going to enter the commerce of the U.S., I can put them into a foreign trade zone, avoid any unnecessary exams or compliance requirements on toys that are not intended for the U.S. commerce. By doing this, I'm able to streamline my supply chain, move the goods through the U.S., in bond, into Mexico and Canada where they meet all the requirements. So this is an example why some toy companies in the past have used the foreign trade zone as a supply chain solution rather than to see as a necessary financial savings, for example. So there's two different types of foreign trade zones. The first and most commonly used foreign trade zone is called a general purpose zone. This is a general purpose zone is typically for distribution companies that are 3PLs, for example, third-party logistics companies, as Stu will talk about today. Also, you can do low-level manufacturing in general purpose zones. You commonly will see things like ports, industrial parks, former government bases will typically utilize the general purpose zone concept. There are some limitations in that you're not allowed to conduct retail trade in a general purpose zone. Additionally, your foreign trade zone has to be within 60 miles or 90 minutes of a port of entry. So an interesting story of how that works is understanding the 60 miles or 90 minutes. That's what the regulation says, and that's what the law says. So companies in the trade have actually used some creative thinking to maximize their benefits of that, that distance limitation. There's a company called IKEA that's up in El Cajon Ranch that wanted to be a foreign trade zone, but they obviously were outside the 60-mile radius. And for most of us, they're outside the 90-minute radius as well. But they were able to reach out to a grantee here in Southern California and through the designation process, prove to the Foreign Trade Zone Board that they can get from the Port of Los Angeles to Cajon Ranch in 90 minutes. Sounds like they were probably going about 90 miles an hour, 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday night. But in doing so, they met that requirement. They used their creative thinking, and they actually were able to designate IKEA as a foreign trade zone in Cajon Ranch to temporarily activate and benefit from the foreign trade zone program. So again, you also have to make sure customs resources are doable and customs can support this creative thinking. But these are some of the different things that you see in the foreign trade zone that allow you to use the flexibility of the program to maximize those benefits. So today, IKEA now, I believe, is under a foreign trade zone in Bakersfield because they've created a foreign trade zone in Bakersfield now. But for a period of time, IKEA was able to benefit from the program by looking at this specific regulation and finding ways to maximize those benefits. Another advantage of the general purpose zone is you can be a private importer, or you can be a general third-party logistics company that brings in multiple users. So you have that flexibility as well. The other type of foreign trade zone is a subzone. A subzone is typically used for companies that are doing heavy manufacturing, or they're outside that 60-mile or 90-minute, and they want to become a subzone. There is no distance requirement for a subzone. Again, you still need to be able to work with U.S. Customs and help them with managing their resources so that they can support and enforce the program. But subzones have that flexibility to where they don't need to be right up near the port. They can be quite a ways outside of the port, for example. You're still not allowed to conduct retail in a subzone. So you see some of the larger companies like automobile manufacturers, some electronics companies, Caterpillar is another example of a company that's a subzone today around the country to utilize the subzone concept instead of the general purpose zone concept. But both concepts are very doable and are very easy to access and participate in through the Foreign Trade Zone program.
Now, David, why would an automotive company want to be in a subzone?
Absolutely. An automotive company would want to be in a subzone is because they're able to manufacture foreign parts that have been imported into the United States, and then they're able to manufacture into a finished product. That finished product has a smaller duty rate than those parts. And in fact, in a couple slides, I'm going to show you a detailed explanation of how that works for manufacturing, whether it's automobiles or food products or anything that you could imagine that you would manufacture can be done in a foreign trade zone with a couple exceptions. So let's understand the hierarchy. How is this program managed and enforced here in the United States? Well, first of all, the Department of Commerce is the one that came up with the program back in 1934. And they actually brought it to the president and brought it through Congress to get approved. They created this program that established 3 different heads that manage the Foreign Trade Zone Board. It's the Department of Commerce, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Treasury. So these three entities are part of the Foreign Trade Zone Board, and they're tasked with managing, interpreting, and making any changes that are necessary to the Foreign Trade Zone program. One key thing to understand there is that the U.S. Customs is not part of that management process. And it's important to understand that, because this is a Foreign Trade Zone program that's essentially asked Customs and told Customs, we need you to enforce a program that's going to take revenue away from you, and we're going to ask you to add more staffing and add more cost to your program. So this isn't a program that initially was very favorable to U.S. Customs, but as the program's evolved, Customs has become very supportive of the program, but Customs is tasked with enforcing the program, not with managing or interpreting the program. But at the end of the day, the Foreign Trade Zone Board cannot be expected to be able to understand and manage every entity that participates in this program. So they've issued grants to public utilities or nonprofit organizations to manage the Foreign Trade Zone program on their behalf regionally. So for example, the Port of Long Beach is a grantee that manages this program and promotes this program here in Southern California through a grant that they have with the Foreign Trade Zone Board. But in addition, we can't expect the Port of Long Beach or any grantee to then understand the intricacies and the compliance requirements for every warehouse operator or every warehouse company that's using the program. So then the grantee issues operators agreements to either a general purpose zone operator that is providing services to sometimes one or more users, or to a subzone operator that's responsible for its own product coming into the zone. So the operators are responsible to U.S. Customs to be in full compliance of all regulations and laws, not the grantee. The grantee is there to act as a liaison and oversee the program and promote the program. And then again, the grantee reports back to the Foreign Trade Zone Board as well. So that's the hierarchy and how the program has evolved. These numbers here are a little old, so I apologize. Supervisor Teruya may have some better numbers than I have. These are quite old. These actually go back into the 70s and 80s. But there's definitely, over 252 foreign trade zones now than there was back in 1970. There's still plenty of subzones that are throughout the United States. I believe the number's grown to over 500,000 jobs have been created or are being used throughout the United States to manage foreign trade zones. You're still seeing an average of 60% or more goods that come into a foreign trade zone are domestic goods. And this is largely because of the manufacturing benefits. So the idea of this program is not to eliminate manufacturing from the domestic industry, but to work with the domestic industry to bring in components and raw materials that are produced here in the United States, along with foreign components, and manufacture them. So we still see a large volume of domestic goods in foreign trade zones, more so than foreign goods in some cases. The actual number of value of goods coming into the zone, I believe, has grown up to over $500 billion nationally, but maybe we can get a little bit better numbers on that. But it's a program that's been growing for quite a while, exponentially, and is now being treated as a very large program here in the United States that deserves its necessary attention with the U.S. government. We're still seeing a large amount of exports coming out of foreign trade zones as well. So the idea here is goods are then coming out of the zone and they're being exported to be delivered to consumers all over the world. That number has grown to well over $100 billion as well. So we'll try to get some better numbers there. So I apologize for these outdated numbers I have here on my slideshow. So let's now understand what can we do in a foreign trade zone. Let's start talking about the benefits. So as you can see here, you can literally do almost anything you want in a foreign trade zone within reason. There's obviously some exceptions, but basically you can store goods in a foreign trade zone. You can manipulate goods in a foreign trade zone by doing things like repackaging, relabeling, cleaning, inspecting, fixing, sampling goods in a foreign trade zone. In some cases, you can also exhibit goods in a foreign trade zone. And then you can also manufacture, whether that's final stage manufacturing, bringing your entire manufacturing process into a foreign trade zone, or manufacturing goods to meet NAFTA requirements or CAFTA requirements. All of this can be done in a foreign trade zone. And then lastly, you can destroy goods in a foreign trade zone. So you may think, why would I ever want to destroy my own product that I've just brought into the United States and lose all of that money? Well, what if I bring in a product that turns out doesn't meet the quality standards of my customer? If I bring in Nike shoes that now has a bad sole, I realize it was manufactured incorrectly overseas. I realize that it has a poor sole. If I go to deliver these to my customer, now there's a bad name for Nike. The shoes are considered bad and it hurts their branding. If I don't deliver the goods and I give them away to charity, now I'm giving them away to people that are now wearing bad shoes, and they come away with, I'm wearing bad Nike shoes. Nike's not a good shoe anymore. But if I destroy the goods in the foreign trade zone, I never have to pay the duty. I cut my losses on any additional costs it would require, whether that's exporting them back to overseas or having to destroy them here in the United States. I can destroy them in the foreign trade zone and minimize my loss, and also make sure no one's ever going to think poorly of Nike because of a poorly made shoe in this case. So destroying goods in a foreign trade zone is something we see happen quite often when the right circumstances arise.
So you're not going to save their souls.
Exactly. Okay. Definitely not going to save their souls.
And also, if the shoes have been imported and duty paid on them, then they discover the problem. You can actually place them in a zone as zone restricted, destroy them, and claim drawback. In other words, a refund of the duty.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to get into that as well. So it's funny that Bruce brought up Lamborghinis, because Lamborghinis is one of my examples too. A little bit different, but still a good example here. These are automobiles or Lamborghinis that were imported from Italy. They were brought into the United States. They do not meet any DOT or EPA requirements. These Lamborghinis were brought in. The customer did not have a bond. You don't need a bond to bring goods into a foreign trade zone. They did not pay any duties. They did not post a bond, but they were able to manipulate these Lamborghinis by removing the passenger seat, adding some decals. They then did what's called a temporary removal from a foreign trade zone, where they temporarily removed the Lamborghini. It was used in a race, or was used for testing purposes. And then after 120 days, it had to be returned back to the foreign trade zone, where it was then returned back to Italy. By doing this, the importer did not pay a bond, did not pay any customs fees, and did not have to meet any compliance requirements because of the benefits of the foreign trade zone program. So the question always is, well, if it was in a race and it hit the side of the wall and it was broken into 100 different pieces, what then happens? As long as those 100 pieces and every piece of that Lamborghini are returned to the foreign trade zone, you're still in full compliance, and then you can export all of that back out. So there's definitely a lot of room here for flexibility and creative thinking in a foreign trade zone to maximize the benefits of the program. Other examples is alcohol. Many times when alcohol is transiting to the United States or coming into a foreign trade zone, there may be some broken bottles that arise. You may, create some damage to liquor. Well, the problem with liquor is liquor has a very high tax rate. It has a much lower duty rate, but those are still fees that you're having to pay on broken bottles. But the thing about liquor is when you break a bottle of liquor, it can't be fixed. It's destroyed more or less. So now instead of paying duties and taxes on something you can never fix or deliver to your customer, you can file a customs form to have it to show that it has been destroyed, or have it completely destroyed, so you eliminate those duties and taxes. So this is an advantage of the foreign trade zone as well. Another example is cigarettes that were imported into the United States. They happen to not have the Surgeon General warning. They were able to bring these directly into a foreign trade zone, add the Surgeon General warning as a labeling request, and then be able to enter them into the commerce, clear customs, and be in full compliance of customs regulations and other government agency regulations as well. And then again, here are TVs that did not have an English owner's manual. They were brought directly into a foreign trade zone. They exchanged the Chinese owner's manual with an English owner's manual to meet the full compliance requirements for entering the commerce of the U.S. So again, these are a lot of reactive benefits that the program offers. Here are actually wheel rims that were having country of origin markings added, like Bruce had mentioned earlier. And it's similar to his Lamborghini example in the top left-hand corner. This is heavy industrial equipment where they actually switched out the engine, put in a U.S. engine, then we're able to clear customs and meet the time requirements for the construction site to have the tractor and equipment that was necessary. So these, again, more reactive benefits. Probably my favorite example is in the bottom right-hand corner. This is satellite equipment. So satellites are, there's a satellite company up in Northern California that actually manufactures satellites. They take parts from all over the world, including the U.S. They bring them into their foreign trade zone where they're able to defer the duty that they would typically pay. And that's everything from nuts and bolts to the wiring to the electronics to the technology that's required for a satellite. The interesting thing, in a foreign trade zone, they're able to manufacture that satellite into an actual satellite. Well, once they're done manufacturing that satellite, then they do what we call a zone-to-zone transfer. They send that satellite to Cape Canaveral. Cape Canaveral is a foreign trade zone, and what do we do in Cape Canaveral? But we send satellites to space. By sending that satellite to space, all the parts that were used to make that satellite have met the requirements to export the goods out of the United States. The regulation doesn't say you have to export the goods to another country, just that you have to export them. So by sending it to space, they're able to successfully export the goods from the U.S. and eliminate all duties and fees associated to those parts that were used in the satellite, creating millions of dollars in savings. So these are, again, more creative examples that show you how being creative and thinking outside the box, you can maximize your benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program.
Yeah, when I was with Hughes, we looked long and hard at designating our satellite factory in El Segundo as a subzone. But when we looked at it, we were already claiming drawback on the satellites because when they're sent into space or sent to French Guiana, they're considered exported. So we got drawback on it. But it came down to the plant was too spread out, and we didn't trust the engineers and technical people there to meet all the requirements, so we never did it.
Can understand
Didn't
that.
feel like we had good control over
Yes.
it. Yeah.
So who actually benefits or uses the foreign trade zone? As you can see here, typically importers and exporters are going to see the greatest benefit of the foreign trade zone. But literally everyone in your supply chain is going to benefit directly or indirectly from the foreign trade zone. Customs brokers benefit, trucking companies, suppliers benefit, freight forwarders benefit. How do they indirectly benefit? If I can use a foreign trade zone and create millions of dollars in savings through my foreign trade zone program, that then allows me to reinvest that money into my business to grow my business, which then grows volume of entries for brokers. It grows the volume of goods coming into the United States for freight forwarders. So they see an indirect benefit through the program as well.
I was going to add, if you're considering using a foreign trade zone and you're already importing stuff and using a customs broker, you need to ask if you have an existing broker, you need to ask your broker, do you do foreign trade zone entries? Yes or no, because not all of them do. And do you do foreign trade zone entries? And I would not only look for a yes or no answer, I would then ask them if the answer is yes, we do. Well, tell me what clients do you do them for and how many do you do, just to prove that, yeah, they got the capability and know how to do it. Because, once again, not all of them do. If you're doing a broker source selection, that should be a criteria in your selection. Can you do foreign trade zone entries? If so, how many do you do and where do you do them?
Exactly. So we've talked about reactive benefits of the program. But more importantly, let's now start talking about financial benefits or proactive benefits that the program offers, such as duty deferral or cash flow benefits, inverted tariff or duty reduction, which is a manufacturing benefit, or cost of money or duty elimination, where I'm eliminating my duty completely on an export. There's also opportunities to avoid drawback or expedite drawback in a foreign trade zone. And there's also opportunities for tax exemptions, quota benefits. In some states, there's an inventory floor tax that can be deferred or eliminated. And then there's federal excise tax that can also be benefited in a foreign trade zone. So first one is duty deferral. This is where I'm able to bring my product into the United States. It's usually a finished product. I bring it in. I have it sit in my foreign trade zone. I'm not paying any duty up front. I'm only paying duty when it leaves my foreign trade zone. So if I need to build my inventory or bring goods in ahead of the timeline to deliver to my customer to make sure that I don't run into any problems like exams or inspections or even logistical problems. I can bring those goods in early enough, store them in my foreign trade zone, and not have to pay any of the duties or broker fees up front because I'm able to wait until it actually ships out. And then you only pay those fees when it ships out.
And you're also deferring the MPF, and as you're going to get weekly entry, you can play some other games with the MPF.
Absolutely.
Excuse me, other strategies with the MPF.
Yes. The other fee, as well as harbor maintenance fees, are also deferred in a foreign trade zone as well, but just on a quarterly basis. So here's an example of a company that used this. So they're saving $18,000 just through that deferral or cash flow benefit. The next one is the duty reduction example. This is manufacturing. So this is where I bring in raw materials or components. In this case, these are components that are parts of a vehicle that have a duty rate of 5%. When I manufacture that, those parts into a finished vehicle, my finished vehicle now has a duty rate of 2.5%. There's a 50% savings. And you're only paying duty on the foreign value of that vehicle. So if I use U.S. components, those I'm not paying duty on that value, only on the foreign value. So again, it allows me to see a reduction in my duties through the foreign trade zone program. So the manufacturing duty reduction program can also get, again, more creative. So this is also a program with duty reduction where if I'm bringing in parts that have a lower duty rate than my finished product, or I have parts that have a higher duty rate than my finished product, I want to have my cake and eat it too. So on those low duty rates, I'm going to set those parts in stone by giving them a different status. And so now the duty rate on my frame, which has a duty rate of 4.3%, I'm only going to pay 4.3%. Where my finished product has a duty rate of 5.5%, so then things like the saddles and the spokes, I'm going to want to benefit from duty reduction by claiming those in a different status that allows them to then be reclassified as a finished vehicle in and only, or a finished I think bike here, and only pay 5.5%. So this is the only time you get to have your cake and eat it too, is by, again, playing with those different zone statuses and maximizing the benefits that the program has to offer in your manufacturing process. And then lastly is the duty elimination. So this is bringing my goods into my foreign trade zone where I'm either manufacturing them or bringing in finished goods, but I'm not delivering them to the U.S. commerce. I'm delivering them to world commerce. So they're going to other countries, to other consumers outside the United States. So now I get to export these goods without ever paying those duties. So it's important that you're able to see maximize those benefits by eliminating those customs fees completely. The only fee you don't eliminate, though, is the harbor maintenance fee. So this is an example of a company here in the Inland Empire that saves $768,000 a year, and they never use drawback. They were always paying their duty and exporting their goods. And now with the foreign trade zone, they're going to see a tremendous savings by implementing the foreign trade zone program. And then, of course, we're back to liquor, to beer and wine and other spirits. Like I had said before, liquor has a tax rate that can get as high as 80%, especially on the hard liquor. So what this means is when I bring my goods into a foreign trade zone and I now want to deliver them into the commerce, I'm going to pay a duty rate and a tax rate. If it's, for example, tequila, I'm going to be paying upwards of 80% on just the tax alone. In a foreign trade zone, I can defer that tax until I'm ready to deliver it to my client, or I can eliminate that tax if I export the goods out of the United States. So this has become a significant solution for companies that import and distribute alcohol and liquor here in the United States or around the world.
And if you drink it in the zone, what happens?
It's not something you want to do in a foreign trade zone. It's not allowed.
We have a question in the back.
Yeah. What if you bring the goods in to make the alcohol and you manufacture it in the foreign trade zone? Are you then doing 80% if it's technically?
Again, you can definitely do that. You need to follow the guidelines and compliance requirements. To do that would be unique with TTB and FDA, as well as with U.S. Customs. But it really would come down to how much of the manufacturing process was happening and what those components were to determine if your country of origin were to change. If you meet all the requirements to change your country of origin, then there's a potential to have that branding benefit, but you're still going to have to pay duty on your raw materials eventually. But it wouldn't be the duty on the raw material, but it'd be duty on the finished good, which may be, for example, tequila or whiskey. So there definitely is benefits there, but it's understanding all of the different components into that process to see what those benefits may turn into.
I also understand a lot of alcoholic beverages are actually imported in big stainless steel tanks, and they bottle it here. Does that make a good foreign trade zone operation?
Absolutely. Yeah, we definitely see that happen a lot. Is being able to do that final stage manufacturing or bottling or assembly process in a foreign trade zone as well.
Yeah, David, I have a quick comment on this.
Sure.
Interesting example about these liquor warehouses. Some of the main operators of these foreign trade zones housing liquor are actually the cruise ship lines, because most of that consumption actually happens offshore out there in international waters. Very similar to Bruce's comment about the satellite being exported, not to another country, but out to space. Very similar situation for the consumption of the liquor, out in the water, so they avoid the tax, that way too.
Absolutely.
And my biggest,
It's very convenient.
Yes, very much so.
my biggest client base is the international airlines. I handle all the liquors and wines for American, United, and Delta, JetBlue, and others. And they're in my foreign trade zone because it's so easy to do the paperwork and get everything done, but also because there's no drawback involved or anything else. They put them on an international flight and off they go. So they're definite. FTZs have the definite awareness of the alcohol industry.
And so then lastly, some of the other smaller benefits, like I had said before, is harbor maintenance fees can be deferred in a foreign trade zone as well. You can never eliminate this fee, but you can definitely defer it on a quarterly basis. And then probably one of the most exciting things that happened to this program was what happened in 2000 when President Clinton signed into law the weekly entry program. This is really the program that started allowing companies that wanted to bring finished goods into the U.S. and defer that duty, and then eventually enter the commerce and create advantages for those goods. Manufacturers use this program as well, but that distribution advantage really set hold in 2000 and has really helped to exponentially grow the foreign trade zone program to where it's not just a benefit for manufacturers, but also a benefit for distributors and importers of finished goods. So essentially the way the weekly entry program works, or was working before the weekly entry, is if I had 500 entries a year, and if my value of my entry exceeded $140,000, my merchandise processing fee would cap out at $485. So what that meant was I bring in $140,000 worth of goods on one shipment. I would pay a percentage rate of 0.3464% of my value as my merchandise processing fee, but that fee had a cap of $485. So if I brought in 500 entries that met that same cap, that meant I was paying $485 500 times a year, which equated into about $217,000 in MPF fees annually. But if I'm in a foreign trade zone and I use the weekly entry, I now get to file one entry a week instead of multiple entries per day or multiple entries per week. I file just one entry, which means I pay a merchandise processing fee only once a week. So instead of having 500 entries, I now have 52 entries. So then my merchandise processing fee annually is only $25,000. So we're gonna show you how those benefits can create significant savings just purely by having high volume or high activity. I'm able to benefit by minimizing this merchandise processing fee.
So you mentioned before toy companies, and toys are duty-free, but they still take the MPF.
Exactly.
So they would make a good candidate for this.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. So let's understand how this program works without the foreign trade zone. Goods come from my foreign supplier. They come to the Port of Los Angeles. They're met there by U.S. Customs, where the goods are cleared on a Customs Form 3461 or ACE cargo release now. The goods then leave the terminal. They go to my distribution center. 10 days after clearing customs, I am now subject to paying my duties and customs fees. One of those fees is my merchandise processing fee. So if I have 25 shipments a week that meet that cap of $140,000 in value per shipment, I'm paying for 25 entries to be filed. I'm paying a merchandise processing fee 25 times, which gives me a cost of about $12,000 in just the merchandise processing fee on a weekly basis. So I'm having to pay all of this money up front and that merchandise processing fee as well. So how does this work with the foreign trade zone? Goods still come from my foreign supplier, but instead when they come to the Port of Los Angeles, Customs is there to meet me, but to process a 214, which is a customs form that authorizes me to not clear customs, but to move the goods to my distribution center, which happens to be my foreign trade zone. So the goods get to my foreign trade zone, and as they ship out of my foreign trade zone on a weekly basis, I'm going to file one entry a week, and instead of 25 shipments a week and 25 entries a week, it's now one entry a week, still the 25 shipments. My merchandise processing fee goes down to $485 instead of $12,000. So there's an $11,000 savings or a $605,000 savings annually. Understand that this is a program that helps you save significant amounts of money with little to no impact in your operations, little to no impact in your logistics and supply chain. It allows you to ship goods out of your FTZ or distribution center at any time of day, at using any mode of transportation during that 7-day period. I am essentially telling Customs, I estimate that I'm going to ship this amount of goods for my upcoming shipping week. And at the end of that shipping week, I reconcile with U.S. Customs by paying my merchandise processing fee and other duties through the entry summary process. So I get to meet the just-in-time concept, have no impact to my operations, and see a significant financial savings through the program. You obviously want to meet all of the other compliance requirements set forth by Customs and the Foreign Trade Zone Board, but this is a program that we now see large distribution companies, importers that are bringing in finished goods can maximize their benefits through the Foreign Trade Zone program. So here are a couple of examples of companies that have realized these savings. The one at the top, which actually isn't in Long Beach anymore, is actually Skechers that's now in Moreno Valley. They save over $1 million a year just on the merchandise processing fees that they're able to save on through the weekly entry. They see other benefits through the duty elimination and the duty deferral benefits, but this is one of their larger savings components in the program. So what are some of the other benefits that we haven't mentioned yet? First of all is just the greater flexibility to do business in a foreign trade zone. The ease of paperwork. Nearly every paperwork process is automated now with U.S. Customs. The only one left is the 216, which is not a document that's used very often, but when it is used, it is still a manual process. There's no bond required by the importer. Now, the operator needs to have a bond, but the importer doesn't need to have a bond. There are high security expectations, but we found the security expectations is meeting, in most cases, the common sense requirements of how you would want to protect your own cargo with alarm systems, cameras, things like this. In addition, you also have to have signs on the front of your building identifying that you are a foreign trade zone and that you are subject to search and seizure by U.S. Customs when required to. There's opportunities to avoid fines, like we talked about in a lot of the reactive benefits. My goods don't come in correctly or not in compliance, I can bring them into a foreign trade zone and bring them into compliance before entering the commerce. There's also opportunities for U.S. quota avoidance, like Bruce had talked about, and then tariff advantages when we talked about manufacturing and so forth.
I understand there are some companies that store stuff in foreign trade zones because of the security requirements, not for any tariff benefits.
Absolutely, and so you have those. There's severe consequences for not following those rules. And typically, if someone were to break into a foreign trade zone and steal something from a foreign trade zone, when it's not a foreign trade zone, it's the local police, following up with an investigation, and you go to the local jail and through the court system and so forth. But if you break into a foreign trade zone and steal something from a foreign trade zone, you're now stealing something from a federal entity. It's a federal crime, and it has much sharper and severe consequences. So there's definitely, those become deterrents for the program, as well as the operators doing everything they can to secure and protect their cargo. So we do absolutely see that happen.
I heard there is a foreign trade zone located in a salt mine. Is that true?
It might be.
Kansas or someplace?
It might be. I'm not aware of that one, but
Good place.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. So there are other advantages. For example, if you're doing high volume goods into your foreign trade zone, you can actually file for the benefit of a daily 214 instead of a 214 per shipment. So if I'm bringing in 140 shipments a day, I don't want to file 140 214, so I'm able to file a daily 214. On the 216s, which is that document that lets me manipulate or destroy goods, I can use that document. If I can prove to customs that I do it repetitively enough, I can use that document on an annual basis with customs approval. So there are a lot of these different things that help you manage your business more efficiently that the program offers as well. And lastly, that's the end of my presentation. The goal, of course, here was to give you more information how the program works, how to be creative when using the program to maximize those benefits. Thank you very much.
Okay. What questions do we have? Oh, what questions do we have? I'll give you one. When I worked for Hughes, we were a General Motors subsidiary. And I remember going to Motown and meeting with one of the GM custom staff, and he showed me a huge stack of documents. And he said, this is our application to designate our Arlington, Texas assembly plant as a subzone. And it took us, a long time, several months and several $100,000 in various fees to get that approved, because we had to show it was in the public interest and all these other things. Is that still a lengthy, complicated process?
The subzone, to become a foreign trade zone as a subzone, it is still somewhat lengthy in the sense that you still have to go through a lot of that process. It takes a subzone an average of 6 months or less to become a foreign trade zone, but some of the components in that application process have greatly been streamlined, especially with U.S. Customs. For example, background investigations sometimes would take 6 to 12 to 18 months when it was being outsourced. Now that it's being handled by Customs in-house, and it's a vetting process instead of a background investigation, that process now happens very quickly. But there's a two-step process in becoming a subzone. One, you have to prove your public utility or public interest benefit. Then you have to designate your property. And then lastly, you have to activate your foreign trade zone subzone with U.S. Customs. So there still is a process involved. General purpose zones usually happen in about 3 to 4 months, so they're a little bit less, but there's less happening in a general purpose zone than typically with a subzone. But the processes for those applications have significantly decreased over the years, which is great.
We have a question in the back.
Yeah, how does free trade agreements like NAFTA with Japan, how does that affect foreign trade zones? Can you explain that?
Sure. So, when you have duty-free programs like NAFTA or CAFTA or the GSP duty-free programs you have, those definitely are great programs to be part of. They also take some of that value to be a foreign trade zone away in some cases. So, for example, if I'm importing something from Mexico that qualifies for NAFTA, my goods are coming in duty-free. So again, I'm not looking to use the foreign trade zone to alleviate any duty implications, because there are no duty implications under NAFTA or CAFTA or some of these other programs. But there still are other advantages, like the weekly entry program with minimizing merchandise processing fees, having the flexibility to bring goods that may not meet the compliance requirements and then bring them up to those compliance requirements in a foreign trade zone. So there are other advantages the program offers, but we typically find companies that are participating in a program that eliminates that duty, they're less likely to use the foreign trade zone unless there's other circumstances that would drive it. We also find another thing, I'm sorry to interrupt, but another thing too is companies will bring goods into the United States, put them in a foreign trade zone where they're then able to bring them into compliance for NAFTA. So they can benefit from some of those free trade programs if they can comply with programs like NAFTA and so forth. So we see the reverse happening as well.
Or put them in the zone until you can get like a certificate of origin or something?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or if I do I bring product, for example, from Asia into my foreign trade zone, and I do final stage manufacturing that allows me to change my country of origin from Asia to, for example, the U.S. or to another NAFTA country. So I can do things like that that can then give me now, I'm able to qualify for NAFTA where before I was unable to. So those types of opportunities also exist in a foreign trade zone.
Okay, we have two questions. I think the man in the third row, you had your hand up first, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the second row.
Does the operator of the general purpose have to also do the custom entry, or can there be a partnership between a warehouse and a broker
First of all, the only entity that can actually clear customs for your goods is a licensed customs broker, unless you're a self-filer. So operators cannot clear customs for your goods. Now, a lot of times operators will have a relationship with a broker they're familiar with, and when the customer doesn't have a broker solution, they can offer their broker to provide those services. We also see many times importers will bring their own broker to the foreign trade zone so they can clear their goods using their own broker that they're familiar with. Obviously, we want to make sure that that broker is familiar with clearing goods in a foreign trade zone. But when bringing goods into a foreign trade zone, initially you're not filing an entry, you're actually filing an admission document for a 214. That document is not considered customs business, so it does not have to be done by a customs broker. It can be done by the operator, the importer, or any other agent that that may represent the importer. So you have that flexibility on bringing goods in, but when the goods leave and enter the commerce, you definitely have to use a licensed customs broker.
So that tells me a power of attorney is not required for 214.
No, I still require a power of attorney because as a broker, as an agent, I'm still filing documents on behalf of that importer. So if I'm the operator, I would still want that power of attorney because I'm representing that importer with U.S. Customs and providing data from that importer. So it's important that there is a relationship there, and that power of attorney creates that relationship between the operator and the importer when filing customs documents.
Okay, the gentleman in the second row?
Many of the items come from Asia now. These are
Well, first of all, U.S. Customs regulations don't allow you to, you can bring anti-dumping goods into a foreign trade zone, but you're required to put it in a status called privileged foreign. What that status does is it puts that classification or that anti-dumping status in stone, meaning you cannot manufacture those goods and then relieve yourself of that anti-dumping duty. So if I brought in, for example, an automobile parts, and one of those parts was ball bearings. Ball bearings are subject to anti-dumping duties. Those goods would come into the foreign trade zone, they'd be put in privileged foreign status, and I'd be subject to what that anti-dumping duty requirement was at the time it comes into the zone. I can still manufacture those ball bearings into the finished product of a vehicle, but at the end of the day, I'm still gonna pay my anti-dumping fees on those ball bearings, even though it looks like a vehicle now versus a ball bearing. So you definitely can't use the foreign trade zone to circumvent things like anti-dumping or countervailing duty requirements.
It's actually one of the specific focuses, you know, for customs enforcement. I mean, that's one of the things that they're really looking at is commodities subject to anti-dumping. And I have a few more comments about that, and also the other gentleman's question about, you know, how you set up the brokerage and that model. So you'll have some insight into that in my presentation this afternoon. But
Okay, we had a hand up in the, there, okay.
It's actually at the shipment level, but again, If you break out on that 214 that you file with customs to gain authorization to admit the goods is when you have to identify the status of those goods. So again, if I'm bringing in a mixture of goods that requires multiple statuses, I'm going to have to file different documents for each status that I want to apply for. If I'm bringing in a shipment that has wheel rims and ball bearings, if I file, I would want to file two 214s, one for the ball bearings in privileged foreign status and one for the wheel rims, which would be a non-privileged foreign status. Yes, you can. Yes, in fact, we see a lot of companies that import commodities that are subject to anti-dumping duties. They'll bring them into the foreign trade zone, and their intent is to export those goods. And then you eliminate any implications of that anti-dumping or countervailing duty requirements because the goods never entered the commerce. You only are subject to those anti-dumping duty requirements when the goods are cleared and enter the commerce of the U.S., and then you're subject to those requirements. But if you export them from a foreign trade zone, you eliminate those requirements just like you would eliminate the duty.
Yeah, other questions? I think we're done. Let's give another round of applause. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next up is the gentleman to my right, you're probably your left, Supervisory CBP Officer Owen Teruya. Am I saying that right? Teruya. Okay, good. Served 28 years with U.S. Customs and Customs and Border Protection. Where did you start? Here?
In Long Beach.
Okay, so you've always been here in Long Beach?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. Senior CBP Officer Teruya is the current supervisor of the Warehouse Compliance and Carrier Audit Section. Do foreign trade zones fall under that?
Yes, we do.
Okay. All right, you're the guy. The unit is responsible for activation, alteration, suspension, deactivation, and auditing of CBP bonded facilities, including 77 activated foreign trade zones. So you do a little bit of traveling around Southern California, I take it.
Just a little bit.
Okay.
Otherwise known as God.
No, not really.
Okay, you're up.
Well, okay, as David mentioned, 1934, the Foreign Trade Zone Act was enacted for to create, basically, attract companies to create manufacturing zones, to create jobs for American workers. And from the time of its inception through about 1970, they only had like 10 to 12 foreign trade zones. By 1985, they had over 109 foreign trade zones, and U.S. Customs was realizing that the current process they had in place was not going to be able to support the supervision of foreign trade zones. Up until then, Customs had what we call Customs warehouse officers. You had an officer stationed at each bonded facility to process entries, inbound movements, clear freight, and they couldn't support that level of employment, and we just didn't have enough personnel.
With 77 sites, that's 77 people.
Exactly. And of course, the foreign trade zone and bonded warehouses, the number of them have just increased greatly. When I first started in my unit, there were 54 foreign trade zones, and now there are 77, and this is 3 years, in a 3-year period. But because of this, in about 1985, they started to change the regulations. They changed the regulations and created 19 USC 81A, which is a different concept in managing foreign trade zones. They made the trade zone operators responsible for the daily operations of the foreign trade zones, and U.S. Customs or CBP would basically monitor them and audit them to ensure compliance with federal regulations and make sure that everything was being operated and the duties were being paid. So and this is reflected in the regulations 19 USC 81A and 19 CFR 146, Chapter 146. Now, the role of CVP is basically, again, to activate, to authorize alterations, suspend, deactivate, and all these types of actions are required to have the port director's approval. All the regulations state that the local port director is the deciding official on these types of actions, and they need that level of signature. Now, for activations, my office is in charge of activating foreign trade zones, and we represent the port director in those processes. What we highly recommend in the activation process is if you're contemplating starting a foreign trade zone, that you request a pre-activation meeting with U.S. Customs. And you would usually come in with your foreign trade zone consultant and your principals who are in charge of the foreign trade zone and discuss exactly what you intend to do with a foreign trade zone and what you're trying to, where it's going to be, the size of the facility. Sometimes with large companies, they haven't even built the facility yet. That pre-activation meeting can help them to avoid a lot of the pitfalls. And the next step would be to find a grantee. You find your grantee, request, and once you find the grantee, we usually get a letter from the grantee stating that, hey, we're in concurrence that this foreign trade zone project is authorized, and at that point, U.S. Customs will look at the adjacency requirements. As Mr. Harlow mentioned, it's in Treasury Decision 76-130. That decision gives us the geographical limits of our port, and foreign trade zones can be activated under the traditional site framework, and the limit is 60 miles or 90 minutes from the port limits.
And the grantee is somebody like Port of Long Beach.
Yeah, well, the grantee is, as defined in the regulations, is a state-authorized body or entity authorized to oversee a foreign trade zone project. This is that, and the project encompasses all the geographical area under their area of responsibility. Once we get that letter, and we determine that it meets the adjacency requirements, then we send a letter to the Foreign Trade Zone Board concurring that, yes, this foreign trade zone meets the adjacency requirements, and that's all we're doing at that point. However, that letter also states that CBP reserves the right to conduct further review, and some of those reviews include, of course, the sufficiency of the application, which is usually pretty quick. Once we get the application and we work with the applicant, it's a little bit of back and forth, emails, submission of additional documents, adjusting of maps and things like that, and it usually takes about a week to do something like that. What the time-consuming part is vetting of employees, and when we vet employees, it's usually the principals, the corporate officers, and the responsible parties, the people who are going to be responsible for the inventory records and control systems for the foreign trade zone. And a lot of times those documents we don't have the proper supporting documentation. And once we do that, again, we vet it in what's called a global entry system. There's several global entry systems. There's one for trusted traveler, and this happens to fall under the trusted worker global entry module. And then once that's done,
Is that like a background check on the person?
yes, the global entry interfaces with several different law enforcement databases and comes back with any derogatory information, and it gets very intrusive. Sorry to say, we do get very intrusive, and as far as the corporate officers, as long as they haven't committed a felony or committed acts constituting a felony or have been arrested for crimes or misdemeanors involving theft and smuggling, they're okay. You know?
Any customs offenses might stick out, right?
Yeah. But for the employees and workers, any derogatory information can be taken into account. And we take several things into account, how long ago it happened, whether they were a minor at the time, and the severity of the offense, and the nature of the offense. And even then, you know, we never recommend termination. What we'll do is say, this particular employee is not allowed to work within the foreign trade zone or interact with the bonded merchandise. And we don't want anybody to lose their job, but we do need to protect the revenue and protect the merchandise. Okay, now.
Do any companies fail the activation where you recommend that the zone not be activated?
Not since I've been there.
Okay.
Actually, yeah, we haven't really had to say no to anybody, except for adjacency requirements. We have had to deny. I know of just one instance where we had to deny a request due to adjacency requirements, and that was because they were trying to activate in Palm Springs, which is a little bit farther than 60 miles. Yeah. And I do have to make a comment on IKEA. It just so happens IKEA is 59.9 miles away from the port boundary. We looked at that several times and says, really?
Clocked it on your odometer.
59.9 miles, exactly. And so they fall under, and there are several different other things going on with that, but
90 minutes depending on the freeway.
well, you can't really see in Southern California. You really can't say 90 minutes because 90 minutes is not 90 minutes if you're driving on our freeways.
Yeah.
So we rely more on the mileage, and it's not as the crow flies because it has to be by road miles because it doesn't make sense for us to do it as the crow flies. That would take us all the way out of Baker, something like that. Okay, now. The activation process is usually pretty painless, especially if you have a good customs broker or customs foreign trade zone consultant. They will definitely help you. We have had companies who have been through the process several times and who have decided that they want to do it themselves, and that's worked for some people. But usually, if they try to do it themselves, they will run into some problem sometime down the line. So it's well worth a good foreign trade zone consultant. The other things we do is alterations. Now, the things you can alter in a foreign trade zone are the size of your trade zone, the location of your trade zone, and the name of your trade zone. All these are just mere, you send us a letter on company letterhead requesting the change. We'll review it. If it's a size change, we'll go out and take a look at your proposed site, see what you've built out for your foreign trade zone. It could be just to increase the size of a cage. Then it's usually a very quick process. That usually takes less than a month for us to approve. But activations, it all depends on the company. Really, it does. Some can be as quick as 3 months, 4 months, and some can take years. I mean, and usually it gets to the point where we ask them to get a bond that the process stops. and we're just waiting for them to submit the bond. And yeah, but once we get all the paperwork done and everything done, it's just a matter of routing the letter up the chain of command for the signature of the port director. And our letters do get vetted at several levels. My employees send them to me. I look at it. I send it to my chief. She looks at it. And then we send it to the section chief. He looks at it. They send it to the assistant port director. He looks at it. And then the port director will look at it. And at any point in time, and they usually do send it back for correction. So, even though we sent it up, it could take a week or so to get it approved, finally
Reviews
signed.
taking place.
Yes, yes, a lot of reviews. The other things we do is suspension and deactivation. Again, it's just a request on company letterhead. One of the key things that we do have to have in a suspension or deactivation is all bonded customs merchandise must be removed from the bonded area. And when I say that, I don't mean you have to physically remove the merchandise. If you file your entry, clear your merchandise, mark it as cleared and domestic, that's considered to be non-foreign bonded merchandise for CBP purposes. So as long as there's no foreign trade zone status merchandise or bonded merchandise in your foreign trade zone, you know, we can approve the deactivation or suspension. Now, as far as daily operations, my office, you know, when ACE came in and they allowed the 06 foreign trade zone entries to be processed in ACE, we saw a real drop in the number of paper foreign trade zone entries we had to process. But we still do occasionally have what's called the documents required entry. And that's based on various criteria placed in the system by either participating government agencies or import specialists or enforcement teams, which could trigger that documents required flag to hit. And at that point, you will have to submit a paper entry. And actually, you know, some weekly entries when we get the documentation, you know, they're huge. It's a weekly estimate of what they're going to send out of the zone, and that's a lot of review for my people. I feel so sorry for them sometimes, but you know what? It's their job. Yeah, and also, if the criteria that is hitting is input by an import specialist, we do refer it to them for reviewing and vetting, and they will be the ones to take a look and determine whether or not the documentation and the requirements have been met. And for most of the part, weekly entries are an estimate. We realize that. So we rarely ever really just reject a weekly entry. Usually they get, I think 99% of them all get signed off. More, 99.9% get signed off.
If they're an estimate, do they have any obligation to reconcile them later?
Oh yes, it's all reconciled on the 7512 entry summary.
Okay, good.
For liquidation. So once you do your weekly estimate, the entry summaries are filed subsequent at the end of your week period, and you pay your duties, your merchandise processing fee, and your harbor maintenance fees, and you're good to go. Now we come to the CBP 214 admissions. Now, all the 214s are admit your merchandise into the zone. Now, once your merchandise is admitted into the zone, the time limit for your merchandise to remain in the zone is forever. Your merchandise can stay there for as long as you want it. It's in zone status in the zone. Now, this is versus a bonded warehouse. There's a time limit on customs bonded freight going into a bonded warehouse, and that's 5 years. At the end of that 5 years, customs will remove it from the bonded warehouse, send it to a general order warehouse, and auction it off or destroy it. Now, for CFSs, which is another type of bonded facility, a container freight station, it's a 15-day general order period. At the end of the 15 days, your merchandise is eligible for general order, and you have 10 days to move it to a general order warehouse where you either make entry or at the end of 6 months from the date of arrival, it is auctioned or destroyed. So that's one of the big advantages of foreign trade zones if you have merchandise that turns very slowly, and some large equipment may not sell in a year. You know, it can sit there until it's ready to be sold. And I have heard of one instance where there was going to be a change in regulation about 8 months down the line, and it was going to be a reduction in the duty rate, so they input their merchandise as much as they could into a foreign trade zone, and when the regulation hit, they filed entry.
Non-privileged foreign.
Yes, yes. and that's another advantage of it. And the other document that we regularly process is the 216, and that is for manipulations, temporary removals, destructions, and we don't, for destructions, you have to file a 216 for each destruction, and for temporary removals. For manipulations, you do have the option of filing an annual 216, and what that allows you to do is to do your manufacturing, repackaging, kitting of merchandise within the zone. So, and my office's process is that, and we keep paper files. Unfortunately, that is not electronic. Your 3461s or your entries and your CBP Form 214s can be transmitted electronically. And some of the special privilege requests we also analyze or review in my office is the direct delivery requests. Now, direct delivery is basically a privilege that allows you to admit your merchandise into your zone, bring it into your foreign trade zone, and then 24 hours later, after it's been admitted, file your 214. Now, what this eliminates is a lot of manifest discrepancies where your amounts don't match up. You know, it gives you that amount of time to amend the manifest, get it right, without having to file MDR or a manifest discrepancy report. And that's a lot of paperwork savings for customs and for importers.
So the container can come right off the ship and into the zone.
With the
and
direct,
then do the 214 afterwards.
24 hours later.
Good.
That's a,
Not my zone, because I'm a general purpose zone, that has to be.
yes. Now, the caveat to it, or the requirements for a direct delivery, there is 3 requirements. 1, the merchandise is not restricted, and there's no CBP exam required, and no document review is required. The merchandise and the operation of the foreign trade zone is well known in advance, predictable, stable over long term, and relatively fixed in variety or the amounts of different types of merchandise. And the sticking point that we always get is the foreign trade zone has to be the owner purchaser of the goods. And there is a lot of debate as to what is the owner purchaser of the goods, because in CBP regulations, for filing of entries, there is a definition of anyone with a financial interest can be the owner purchasers of the goods, but there have been customs rulings that require that there be more than a nominal relationship between the merchandise and the foreign trade zone, which basically they take to say that it has to be more than a custodial relationship. In other words, if you're manufacturing in the zone, or you have a plant in the zone and you're importing for another company and you're actually manipulating the goods into manufacturing the finished product, that would be considered more than a custodial relationship. But if you're storing goods and you're delivering goods, and that's basically your business, that's considered to be a custodial relationship or a nominal relationship for 3PLs or third-party logistics companies and the user of the foreign trade zone.
So if all you do is receive the stuff, that's not enough. You actually have to do something with the goods.
Yeah. For the most part, yes. Now, and actually, we only have one manufacturing or production zone in our area, and other than the petroleum companies, they're all manufacturing zones or production zones. But all the rest are general purpose zones. And that's about 71 of them are the general purpose zones. And the other thing we also process are non-processing stipulation requests. Now, the MPS is an advantage in that per 19 CFR 146.71C, once you've filed entry and once you've gotten your release you have 5 days to remove the merchandise from the zone. 5 days. If you don't do that, you're subject to penalty and fines. What an MPS does, it allows you for certain SUSA classification to not physically remove the merchandise from the zone, but just change its status in your inventory records and control system. So basically you're changing it from, you paid your duties, everything's done, you're changing its status from zone status merchandise to domestic merchandise. And you don't have to remove it from the zone. That's what an MPS is. And anybody can file for that.
So they just hit a few buttons on the computer and it changes the status.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool.
So now the final component of my unit is called compliance review. And this is where we audit you. We will go out, we will visit foreign trade zones and conduct audits, random audits. Well, not really random. It's based on a criteria of risk, high, medium, and low risk. If you have multiple violations, repeat violations, and are consistently non-compliant, you will be designated as high risk. And we will visit your zone a minimum of 3 times a year and possibly more, or as many times as necessary to bring you into compliance. Having said that, if we do find these violations, we have a concept called informed compliance. If the nature of the violations is a first-time violation, we will send you a warning letter and saying, hey, you violated this regulation. This is what you did. You violated this regulation. Please fix it. If you do it again, then we'll do a liquidated damage or a penalty on you for the same violation. So you could have 10 different types of violation in a year and 10 different warning letters and never get a liquidated damage. And I'm very strict on that we give operators the opportunity to comply, that we're not just out there just automatically penalizing people.
Would that be 10 different types of things that they're
Yes, you know.
pass review, or the 10 of the same thing, the same issue?
Oh no, 10 different types of violations. For example, you had domestic freight in the FDZ bonded cage that we couldn't determine whether it was foreign domestic that was cleared or it's domestic merchandise that came from another state. That's a violation. The very next day or the next time we go out, we find that merchandise was admitted to the zone prior to the CBP 214 being authorized by customs. That's another different violation. So each type of violation we find is a separate violation, and we treat it as such until we find repeat violations. Okay, now the medium risk foreign trade zones we visit twice a year, and low risk every other year. So it really behooves the foreign trade zone to be compliant, because then you only get us every other year. So you don't have to deal with us. Okay.
So therefore, a zone operator could start out by being a high risk, but they could work their way into being low risk if they're passing these reviews.
Oh yes, definitely. And that's happened. In this last year, we had scheduled 84 compliance reviews. And due to improved performance and improved compliance, this year we have 74 compliance reviews. And that's with my staff working with people, explaining to them what they did wrong, how to fix it, and what they expect to see when they go out the next time. And basically, if we find a violation and it's a fixable violation, we'll go out again and just check to see if it's been fixed. And if it has, we may not designate that as a black mark against the foreign trade zone.
When you do a compliance review, how much advance notice are you giving?
We don't give notice. we just show up. But if you haven't been visited in 2 years, you can kind of expect us that year. Yeah. Now, what's coming up for CBP and foreign trade zones in the future is in September, we were supposed to roll over FTZ Online into ACE in September. Now, what FTZ Online is, it's a standalone system through which you transmit your CBP 214s. They're rolling that all over into ACE. However, due to the recent natural disasters we've had, they delayed that and postponed that rollover to December 2016. Not 2016, December 16th, 2017, this year. Now, what they've done is all the EDI interface or the electronic data interface that the Foreign Trade Zone currently has with the ICRS and CBP, those will not be affected. It will be a seamless transition from what you're using now to what's going to be in ACE. There will be no change to what the Foreign Trade Zones do on a normal daily basis as far as interfacing with customs electronically. Now the advantages to this for Foreign Trade Zones, of course, is that now CBP can see everything in ACE. It gives us the opportunity for enhanced document review online, and maybe the next time you get a docs required flag for your E214 or electronic E24 or CBP Form 214, you may be able to submit your documents through DIS or document imaging system, which means you won't have to send me that stack this big of we just got a 214 in. It was this big. It was a daily 214. They had that many admissions.
Just a lot of PDF files instead.
Oh, yeah. So basically that's all I have for you, unless you have any questions as to what we do.
Now, when you do a compliance review, do you get a 214 and go in and, this is what I've heard, you go in and ask them, show me where all these things went.
Yeah.
Where are they now?
Where are they now? Well, there are several things we do. We will check the 214s, your weekly entries, and your 7501s to make sure that they're reconciled properly. We will even walk through your warehouse and look at shipments and say, give me the documentation for this. And then we will do a physical count, and then we will come back to our systems and see when the 214 was submitted, when it was authorized, when the freight was admitted into the warehouse per the ICRS interchange logs. It's quite a process. I will say this. Our compliance reviews are just spot checks, cursory audits. We don't do comprehensive audits. However, for repeat violators, and there's only been one instance where we've had to do this, we will refer the Foreign Trade Zone or the company to the regulatory audit section. And what regulatory audit does is they'll go out and do a comprehensive audit. They may stay 3 weeks to several months going through everything. And the result of that particular audit was that Foreign Trade Zone was suspended for cause. So it does,
like a obligatory deactivation, right?
Yes. Okay. Suspended for cause. And after 5 years, of course, they can reapply, which they did.
They passed the background checks.
Well, nobody was a criminal, so yes, they did.
One question that I had, Officer, was revisiting your comment about the 214s being implemented into ACE on December 16th. Yeah. Is that going to require that all importers or operators or agents have to file electronically, and there's no option to do it manually anymore? Because I know that was a conversation that had been taking place.
Actually, they haven't said that yet, but they've done that to almost every other type of filing.
Yes.
So eventually, yes, I would say yes, but as of now, not officially. But eventually, you may have to have it in some kind of electronic database with customs in order to file your 214s.
Okay, folks in the audience, I have a hand up there.
Actually, it's not cumbersome at all. You just send us a letter, and then we'll check and tell us the address, and we'll check for the adjacency requirements, whether the new location meets the adjacency requirements, and if it does, and you have your site map, then we'll approve your relocation. Now, the question is if you have any foreign trade zone status merchandise in your current zone, how do you get it to your new zone? Okay. You can't file a permit to transfer at this moment in time to move your once you've filed a permit to transfer to move your merchandise from the port to your current foreign trade zone, the system will not accept another permit to transfer. What you can do is a 7512 or an inbound document, an IT. That's the permit to transfer, 6043. The 7512 is your inbound document. You can do that. But basically what we have to do is kind of fudge the document. You can't do a 214 from port code 2704 to 2704. We'd have to do port code 2704 to 2709, which is LA to Long Beach, but it's all the same area. We basically have to do something like that.
Otherwise, the system won't accept the 7512.
That's correct. Or, and this is rarely done, we very rarely do this, but you can file a paper 6043, which is a delivery ticket or permit to transfer. And on rare occasions, we will do that, but we really don't like to do that because it's just paper, and that 6043 has to remain in your documentation for the movement of all your freight to show that it was moved under bond and it was moved with authorization. And if you lose that paper, that's a penalty or liquidated damage. And for any penalty or liquidated damage involving merchandise, and the movement of merchandise is merchandise, the liquidated damage will be for the value of the merchandise. So, and for alcohol and cigarettes, it can be 3 times the value of the merchandise. So you really want to be careful if we're going to use a paper, a 6043 or permit to transfer.
We just did that. We just moved my foreign trade zone from Carson to Santa Fe Springs, and David is my FTZ consultant. He paid me to tell you that, and it was quite an ordeal. It was but Customs was very cooperative. We went to them and we said, okay, what do we do? And there was a little bit of this, well, just do it and we'll figure it out later. But we got it done. It was an awful lot of lot of trucks, a lot of movement, a lot of getting things done, and then there's the aftermath of it, because you have to assign an entirely new 214 because you're now in a different location than you were before, so all your 214s are canceled out and you have a different 214 involved. So it's a lot of work, but it's doable.
Yes.
One thing I did want to follow up on your question, sir, was you had asked how easy the process is to moving from one location to another. One thing to keep in mind, though, as well, is there's the customs process, but before the customs alteration process is you need to make sure your new location has already been designated with the Foreign Trade Zone Board. That designation is usually a 30-day process with the Foreign Trade Zone Board. You work with your grantee to do that. If that new property is already designated, then you skip that process and go straight to working with U.S. Customs on that alteration. So you definitely want to get with your grantee very early. Make sure that your new location is designated. If it's not, then work with your grantee or your consultant to file an application with the Foreign Trade Zone Board to get that designated. And then you can move to that alteration process with U.S. Customs.
Yeah, and there's one thing I want to mention about alterations and activations, and it has to do with name changes. We've had instances where a company has filed a name change with us. However, the company's been bought by another company and they've changed their IRS number. Whenever the IRS number changes, that is a new foreign trade zone. That is a new activation. It's not just a name change. And we've had to go back and require at least twice in my time there with the section that we've had to go back and require them to do a new activation based on a name change.
Yeah, because that tells me it's a new corporation which is running it.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, questions from the audience? What questions do you have? Got a hand up over there?
Yes. And also for manufacturing zones, they can also file 216s for waste. Anything, any part of the components or the raw materials that end up as waste, they can use that to reconcile their records, and that's also a savings for them because they never have to file duties or entry on that, on any waste or anything that's destroyed.
And then to also follow up, those inventory records, that process you explained, it can be very complicated depending on the scope and operation. So many companies will have a very robust inventory control system to help them manage all of that inventory, especially when it's shifting tariff codes. And then we'll also use foreign trade zone software that's out there to help with the automation and with managing those reports that customs will require. So it can get very complicated in trying to manage that inventory and those accounting principles, but there's software out there available that can help you easily manage that as well.
So just to elaborate a little bit on that and I guess give you kind of a real world example, not to take away from what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, but obviously Yokohama Tire is a high volume importer. We have inventory control systems that manage our inventory specifically for that purpose. Just like David said, there's a whole slew of foreign trade zone inventory control and record keeping systems out there. I mean, there's probably 10 or 20 of them out there. Basically, we utilize one of those software providers and have configured an interface to our standard inventory control system to accommodate all of these customs processes and the associated declarations. So I think depending on which way you want to go or how you want to set it up and ensure you're compliant with the declarations and with U.S. Customs, it depends on, how you're managing your inventory currently and if it makes sense to bring in a foreign trade zone software to help assist with those declarations. I guess the second piece of that is, just like he said, they're moving the 214 admission process into ACE. If you have a foreign trade zone software like I was just describing, most of those are actually interfaced with customs and basically support that same function that the ACE functionality will have in, December of this year? Yeah. So, again, for a high-volume importer, I don't even think it would make sense for a high-volume importer necessarily to file all their 214s into ACE. You might be better off at least looking at and reviewing what some of those other software capabilities are.
We have a question up front.
Yeah, that software
I would say, depending on the size of the company, obviously your first undertaking would just be to do like a feasibility study, right? You're looking at all the costs, all the potential benefits, and you're trying to quantify that, right? That's just a quick feasibility to say, does it make sense or not, right? Once you have that nailed down and you say, you know what, the cost savings are going to be pretty significant even when considering additional costs like maybe buying a software, hiring a consultant, that kind of stuff, it may still make sense, but you would then want to roll in those associated costs into the business case. Especially if you're a large company or a corporation that's, looking at numbers. If, you're a startup importer, bringing in, containers from China of different goods, depending on the volumes and the size of the operation, maybe that makes sense, maybe it doesn't, right?
Or does the software have to be approved by CBP if you're going to be using it?
Actually,
basically, sorry, go ahead, officer.
CBP doesn't really recommend or determine what software you're going to use.
Right.
We really have no concern with that. All we're concerned is that your software and your inventory control system is capable of generating the type of reports and tracking the inventory so that my officers can reconcile the 214s, the 3461s or entries, and the 7501s or entry summaries and liquidations.
Yeah.
So as long as it does the job, it's okay.
Yeah.
So it's on the operator of the zone to maintain compliance. However you want to do that is up to the operator. But I will say in the application process, I mean, you do make statements to customs that, you know, obviously you have a grip on your inventory control processes to support a compliant operation.
And what the regulation actually says is that you have to be able to control your inventory. It doesn't tell you how to control that inventory or what those expectations are, other than being able to control what you receive, what you store or manufacture, and also what you ship. So that could be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet if you're a small operation. That could be QuickBooks, which is a very simple inventory control system, or it could be something much more complicated, because you have those complicated moving parts that require you to look at something a lot more elaborate. So it really depends on the scope of your business and your volume and activity to determine how you're going to meet that requirement to control that inventory for customs.
Yeah, other questions from the audience? We have questions from the panel? If not, let's give a round of applause to Inspector Teruya. Thank you. And I think right now it's lunchtime. What's the plan?
You follow Nancy, Kathleen, and myself, but we're gonna go around 2 corners and then end up in another room. So please follow us and whatever.
Okay, and you will be back here at 12:45. Okay, see you then. Bon appetit. Okay. And if any of you want to read up on this subject, a couple of things you can look at. It was referred to this morning by Officer Teruya. That is Part 146 of the Customs Regulations is the primary regulation dealing with foreign trade zones. Is it fascinating reading? No.
Yes, it is.
Oh, I guess it depends on what you do for a living. But for most folks, they would say, no, this is not, it's kind of like sleep-inducing. There's also, I don't think there's an informed compliance publication on foreign trade zones, is there? I don't recall seeing one.
No, there's an informed compliance program.
Yeah, but not a publication. They can go to cbp.gov.
But there is the Foreign Trade Zone Manual.
Yeah, I was going to mention there's a Foreign Trade Zones Manual that you can go to cbp.gov, go to the trade page, and you probably have to go explore around a little bit to see exactly what menu item is under. I'd look under publications first, maybe. And it's quite lengthy. You can download it as a PDF document. It's quite lengthy and quite detailed. So if you want lots of gory detail on how foreign trade zones work and how the regulations work, Foreign Trade Zones Manual, available at cbp.gov, is a good reference publication. Any other ideas for background material and publications?
Well, one thing I was going to add about the manual is actually written in partnership with U.S. Customs and the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones, which represents the trade community, and it's written in as much as possible layman's terms. So sometimes reading the regulation, which is has a very attorney-like feel to it, the Foreign Trade Zone Manual is in a little bit easier to read or understand language. So definitely look at the Foreign Trade Zone Manual.
So it's written for normal people to understand.
I did not say that.
Not the friggin' attorneys. Okay. Our next speaker up, Stu, is, I think you're our next speaker. Let me introduce Stu Spikerman. Not Spiderman, by the way. We learned that at lunch, but Spikerman. Close, but not quite. I've been a foreign trade zone operator for 30 years with zones in New York, Miami, and Southern California. And their foreign trade zone in Los Angeles is a general purpose zone. It's in Santa Fe Springs, correct?
Yes, it is.
Near the 605 and the 105 freeway where they come together?
Right around there, yeah.
Yeah, okay. They accept goods of a general nature, which could mean anything arriving by ocean, road, rail, or air. And Stuart intends to let others on this stage discuss the many advantages operating his own, but he's here to warn you of the possible pitfalls. This is probably the important stuff to hear of running one. His talk is entitled, "So You're Thinking of Starting an FTZ, Are You?" So, are you thinking of starting an FTZ?
I have
Stu?
3 of them now, but I'd start another one in a minute. I am Stu Spikerman. I got in the foreign trade zone game in 1986 because I had a company called Sky Supply, and we were in-flight duty-free concessionaires, and we were buying lots of products like fragrances and cosmetics and gift items and various other things in bulk, and then we were putting them into smaller shipments, and the customs brokers' fees were killing me. And I found out that if you had a foreign trade zone, you could do your own entries, and you didn't need a customs house broker. You didn't need manipulation bonds. You didn't need any of that stuff, and you could do it all yourself. So I've looked for a foreign trade zone, and the nearest one was in Ronkonkoma, Long Island, which is as far away as it sounds. But that's how it used to be then. Foreign trade zones used to be, as Officer Teruya was describing them, they used to be, these municipalities would create foreign trade zones for the purpose of creating jobs in their community. And they would put them in places where, since there were no jobs, there wasn't much going on. So if you wanted to be in a foreign trade zone, you had to truck yourself off to where that industrial park was and put your business in there, which we did. I'm still there. I'm no longer a user in the zone. It used to be the operator was the operator and you were a user. Now I'm the operator user of the place. I run the foreign trade zone now. So we have 3 foreign trade zones. That one in New York, and we have the one here in California. It's in Santa Fe Springs now. We opened that up about 6 years ago, and we just opened one in Miami, and we probably have more coming up. Also, there's probably going to be one in Dallas, and there might be one in Atlanta coming up. But so I've been in this business a long time, and I obviously like the business, and I obviously consider it a worthwhile business, and I don't want to discourage anybody from getting into the business. As you've heard, there are a great many possibilities. The advantages of foreign trade zones are enormous and varied. I mean, I even learned things today that I didn't know about. You're constantly, every time a customer comes to you, you're going to learn something that's interesting and something that's new. Every new customer comes with new possibilities, and every new customer comes with new risks. And it's the foreign trade zone operator assumes all those risks. We have all those risks. They are ours. So as soon as something comes into our foreign trade zone, everybody else disappears out of the picture, and it's just us. So if something is wrong in the way it's brought in or along the way, and we accept it, it's our responsibility. So I want to make 3 points here, and I wrote them down so I get them right. Foreign trade zones have lots of benefits for your clients, but an operator has to know the risks involved. That's number 1 as far as I'm concerned. And number 2 is you need to know ahead of time the difficulties and obstacles involved in starting up a foreign trade zone. As Officer Teruya said, yes, it is a fairly simple process, not to be a plot killer, but until you get to the bond, that can be a killer. And there are other things along the way. But you must know not just the regulations, but the expectations and preferences of local U.S. Customs at each location. Because my foreign trade zone in New York has the customs, my interaction with customs is entirely different from my interactions with customs in Miami and here. And all of them are different. The way I see it, the way I guess it works is New York tends to see itself as more of an anti-terrorism kind of a place, I guess because of 9/11 and other things. And that seems to be their primary thrust. Yeah, they care about regulations, they care about paperwork, they care about revenue, they care about all those things. But their primary thrust seems to be terrorism, and that's how you relate to customs on that level. When in Miami, the customs inspectors show up for their inspections with drug-sniffing dogs. Seems to be that the Miami operation seems to be more about catching drug smugglers and catching smugglers of all kinds. That's their primary emphasis. They also care about regulations. They're very keen on security and theft precautions, but that seems to be their primary thrust. Here, and it seemed California and this district to me seem to be intensely regulatory in terms of their viewing of things. They see things very much within the regulations, and they know what they want. They don't just the regulations are too huge to memorize all of them unless maybe you're David, but Customs has an organized manner that they want things done. And it makes sense, and they'll walk you through them. But if you try to do what I tried to do for my first couple of years here, is to make California customs be like New York customs, you're just going to have a lot of problems, and you're going to end up on that high-risk list, and that's someplace you don't want to be. So all I'm saying is you need to know the regulations, yes, but you also need to work with customs, get a relationship with customs, ask customs what they expect of you, and not to give David a pitch, but frankly, David really helped me a lot. He came into my warehouse, and here I am. I've been a foreign trade zone operator for over 25 years by that time. And he came in and he said, here's your problems. You need to have your folders organized this way. You need to have your warehouse organized this way. You need to have your things placarded this way. And I did that, and my relationship with customs improved immeasurably. And so now we get along very well with customs. So my suggestion is get yourself a knowledgeable person to help you through the whole thing. Now, you've already heard about the benefits of the foreign trade zones. There are many, many, many benefits, but I'm going to tell you about a benefit nobody up here is going to tell you about. If you like 20th century cars, there is a 1999 GTR Nissan limited edition Skyline car that you can have for free. 0 to no miles, book value approximately $45,000. And if you'd like that foreign trade zone, if you like that car, open up your foreign trade zone. I can give you the phone number to call, and before you hang up the phone, they will have that car on a truck headed to your foreign trade zone. They'll give it to you for free because they've been trying to get rid of it since 1999, and they can't. So you can be the proud owner of that car until 2099 or there, because as Officer Teruya said, a foreign trade zone can mean forever. And forever is not always a good thing. It's great with diamonds. It's not so great with things like herpes. But so you have to be careful what you take in. You have to be to the point of paranoia. You have to be very careful what you bring into your foreign trade zone. And every time you get a phone call, if you call a foreign trade zone and say, "Can you do this for me? I want to do this," you will very often find that a foreign trade zone operator is not all that open-armed and welcoming. He's going to ask you a lot of questions. He wants to know exactly what you're up to. And I can tell you that almost every time I pick up the phone, somebody has tequila they want to bring in. Tequila got mentioned earlier. Everybody wants to bring tequila into a foreign trade zone. It used to be flavored vodka in the 1990s, and then it was wine from Belarus, or some guy would go on a cycling tour through the Urals, and he'd come back, he'd find some wine with all the notes and all the flavors, and he was going to sure this is going to be the next big wine, and he wanted to bring it to your foreign trade zone. The problem with all these people is typically they have no FDA approval on any of this stuff. They probably don't even have a liquor license of any kind, and they do not have the right to import any of this liquor, but they're going to put it in your foreign trade zone. And they're going to get all these things. And the problem is, in all likelihood, they won't. And so you're going to end up with this stuff in your foreign trade zone. And now customs holds you responsible. It's going to be up to your obligation is going to be to gather that stuff up, to find a destruction company, to pay to have it trucked over there, to have customs come out to the destruction site and watch the destruction. And it's something you don't want to be involved in. So every call you get, you tend to be cautious, and you ask a lot of questions. I often tell Gilbert, and he probably doesn't like this joke very much. In fact, I'm surprised Gilbert asked me to speak because I think everybody here is supposed to encourage foreign trade zones, and I tell the cautionary tale. I tell him that my definition of a foreign trade zone is it's a place where you take the worst idea you've ever had in your life and you make it somebody else's problem. To me, that's what a foreign trade zone can be. So I don't want to inherit anybody's problems.
What's the strangest thing you've ever seen either put in the zone or they wanted to put it in the zone?
Well, the strangest thing I ever saw, it sounds like a very odd thing, but I wasted a lot of time with this stuff. A very large company, a company that was not in this business at all, some executive, obviously very high up, had found an enormous number of compressed gas cylinders that were not DOT compliant. And this was an impressive company. It was a company they call you up, you want to do business with them. But this guy was convinced that he could bring these things at a very cheap price, containers and containers, but it's always the same number of containers. It's always 2 containers a month. everybody's going to bring 2 containers a month. It's the same story you hear all the time. So he was going to bring in all these containers, and he had letters and lawyers' letters, and he had things from DOT saying maybe he'd get this, and he wanted to bring these cylinders in. And I just imagined a Nissan, 1999 Nissan, surrounded by gas cylinders, because that's about what it would have ended up being. So, and by the way, I'm not the one with the Nissan, but I almost was with the Nissan. David said, I have 5 words for you. Do not take the Nissan. So I didn't. So, because apparently you'd be the laughing stock of this whole thing. So you very often get phone calls from people who don't have DOT compliance, or they don't have some kind of compliance. This is a very constant theme in the foreign trade zone world. People call up and they think they're going to bring a business into your foreign trade zone, and just as you've heard, things get fixed in foreign trade zones. That's what they're there for. And David described it as an island, but it's not a magical island. I mean, it's a real. It's not necessarily even a nice island. It can be like a scary island sometimes for a foreign trade zone operator. So we are very self-protective to the point almost of paranoia. We also had one that we struggled with recently, baby formula, from a very big company, a company you probably would have heard of. And they had 22 40-foot containers of baby formula. It was from grass-fed cows, all organic from New Zealand, and they wanted to bring it in. And they were an established company. And people, even nice companies, hide information from you when you're a foreign trade zone operator. So it took us some digging to find out that they actually didn't have FDA approval for this baby formula. And their plan, we found out they had a distribution center up in northern Hollywood. We said, wait a minute, why aren't you taking this stuff right up to your distribution center? Well, they gave us a runaround, and we found out they actually didn't have an FDA approval for that. So they were going to bring it into the foreign trade zone, park it there until they got their FDA approval. And I considered doing it anyway because it was a big customer and it was a lot of volume, but I didn't do it. I passed on it, and it all worked out. David found him a home someplace else, and it all worked out very well. But these are the kind of things that that foreign trade zones worry about. We worry about a customer coming in and bringing an idea or bringing something in that is not ready to go into the commerce of the United States. It's fine if you're prepared for that ahead of time. That's all very well and good. Officer Teruya mentioned, I think it was the goods that are coming in, anti-dumping goods. Customs is a great source of business for foreign trade zones. They encounter products coming in from China very often. They've been manufactured at a much lower rate than they were being manufactured at previously. And so they will put a valuation that is lower than Customs feels is accurate, or perhaps a classification that is not quite correct. Customs can stop those, insist they go to a foreign trade zone, at which point everything gets offloaded into the foreign trade zone and they're put into NPF status. And what happens is Customs will send a valuation team. They have something like 200 people who do valuations here, and they're real experts. I believe they're mostly civilians, and they come out and they know everything about every product there is. And they'll come out with a couple of Customs officers, and they'll go through all these things, and they'll put a new valuation on it. Now, that's all very well and good when you're dealing with Bassett Furniture, which is who I was dealing with. They're a very reputable company. You don't have to worry about it. But it can be scary when you're dealing with a company that is a non-U.S. company, a foreign national. I'll say from China, but can be from anywhere, because you have no long arm of the law going all the way over to across the Pacific. It's unlikely that if this company, like happened with me, filled my foreign trade zone full of solar panels, and they were on an anti-dumping hold, and they were appealing that, I have a legal agreement that says if they don't pay their bills in a certain period of time, I can seize their goods, yes. But what am I going to do with all these solar panels at a much higher rate of duty? And I'm not a solar panel seller anyway. And by the way, you can only sell those goods for the amount of your losses. Customs does not allow you to seize things and sell them at a very high profit. That's not allowed. So you can't play any games with any of that sort of thing. So I was worried. I lost quite a bit of sleep over this Chinese company that had my warehouse filled with solar panels, and they were being reevaluated. And I was concerned that they might, abandon them and cut them loose, like David was saying, people can do. But fortunately, they took them back to China and everything worked out all right. But this is a risk you have to deal with. Liquors and wines have constant licensing and regulatory problems, and those are my bread and butter. That's who I deal with mostly. My clients are American Airlines, United, Delta, the big airlines, and they store their bonded liquors in my warehouse. But I have no concerns about them. But things do go wrong, and I'll tell you about one later on. The wine business in California is a terrific business. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. It's not that far away. And for a wine company, they will typically want to export at least a percentage of their output. And so what they will do is, as David was saying, the tax can be very high on these things. Tax duties can be very high on these things. So what they can do is they can put them into a foreign trade zone and hold them there for a few months before they export them on a schedule. And they can get all their tax back. So it's a great cash flow thing. If you can get a customer who's a good, reputable wine company, and you can work with them on a scheduled basis so they get the drawback on that, it's a terrific situation. But there are other such people, and they're called gray marketers or diverters, and what they do is they will buy wines and they will buy liquors and they will buy things that they're not supposed to buy. They've got some in with the company, and they'll put them in a foreign trade zone to get the drawback, which I've had happen, and then they get caught, and now they can't get their stuff out of your foreign trade zone, and you're sitting there with, in my case, 1,000 cases of wine for much too long. And so you have these problems where you have to face the possibility you may have to have it destroyed. What are you going to do? You can be in difficult situations. So foreign trade zones, our operators tend to be very cautious about who we take in. I would say, Gilbert will call me once in a while and he will ask me if he'll give me a lead on somebody. And David calls me once in a while and he'll say, I've heard somebody's looking for a foreign trade zone. And I have to say, I don't think I've ever taken any of the leads because I'm far more cautious than most people are. I want to have repeat customers. I want to have reliable customers. I want to know that they know what they're doing, and I want to work along with them. It's kind of like the oxygen mask thing on an airplane. You got to put your own oxygen mask on first before you can protect your client. I want to make sure that my customers are well taken care of and they can be sure that everything's going to be okay in their foreign trade zone before I bring them in. And I want to know they're okay and they want to know I'm okay. So a foreign trade zone operator, since they have to bear all the risks, has to also be proactive in terms of protecting their clients and protecting themselves. Reevaluated goods can be abandoned. I've told you the story of the mirrored furniture and solar panels. And general purpose zones like myself tend to be specialized. So as you've heard, there's an enormously wide range of things that people will do with general purpose zones. And I'm basically a cases in, cases out guy. And that started from my history with the liquor business. And that's what I'm most comfortable with. So I don't do pick and pack, and I don't do refrigerated goods. And I don't do perishables of any kind. I don't do hazardous materials of any kind. I don't allow them in my foreign trade zone. I'm kind of cautious about chemicals. I'll bring it as well. And I don't do long-term storage, except I have one client who's a very long-term storage client. He accumulates a resin all year long and then destroys it at the end of the year, and he gets a big drawback on it. It's some sort of a tax thing. I don't know what it is. So he's very good. So if you call a foreign trade zone and they seem to be a little odd and asking way too many questions for you, you should know why. They are at enormous risk. And I want to tell you what that risk is. That risk is the stumbling block Officer Teruya mentioned. That's the operator's bond. Now, I have a foreign trade zone in New York since 1986. It's a 50,000 square foot warehouse. My operator's bond is $50,000. 50,000 square feet, $50,000. It's not based on the square footage. $50,000 happens to be the minimum bond size in New York. That's why. And so I came out here and I opened this foreign trade zone, And I spoke to the Port of Long Beach, and I spoke to a whole bunch of people, and I spoke to my FTZ consultant, who was not David at that time, and I spoke to a number of people, and I decided this is the place I want to have a foreign trade zone. So I took, since, as Officer Teruya said, it takes, it can take up to 6 months to get this thing approved, but typically I expected to get it done in 3 or 4 months. I took the smallest warehouse I could find. I didn't have any actual business going on, with the right to expand. I took a 10,000 square foot warehouse, 1/5 the size of my warehouse in New York. And I did something you should never do as a foreign trade zone operator. I assumed it would probably be maybe another $50,000 bond. And I progressed ahead. And since I was already an existing foreign trade zone operator for 25 years, I had absolutely no problem doing the application. I had Long Beach, Port of Long Beach helped me enormously with my application, with the entire process. We were breezed through the Foreign Trade Zone Board because we know those people very well. And it came back to Customs. Customs came out to my warehouse. I was familiar with what we needed to have done. And Officer Ariano came out and looked around. And he said, "This looks terrific. Everything looks fine. I've got your Foreign Trade Zone manual, which my consultant wrote for me. And we'll take this back to the office and we'll let you know what your bond is going to be." So I said, "Okay, great. It looks like we're ready to go." And about a week later, I get a letter from U.S. Customs that gives me the good news is that my bond has been set at the minimum amount for this district. The bad news is that bond is $400,000. That's the minimum bond. Now, $400,000 doesn't sound like much in this day, because we talk about millions and billions or trillions nowadays, but it's a lot when it's coming out of your pocket. I called my surety company, and I said, "Hey, I need a $400,000 bond," and they almost fell off their chair. They said, "What, do you got diamonds?" I said, "No, it's just business as usual." $400,000. That's an outrageous. We'd never heard of a bond of that amount. So, well, that's the bond here. Well, you're going to have to collateralize that all the way up, possibly to $400,000. I said, "I'm not willing to do that. You're in a competitive business. I'll call your competitor." I called his competitor, and they said the same thing. And I called their competitor, and he said the same thing. I called they said the same thing. It took me 3 months to find somebody who would write me that bond without collateral. Well, what is a and then I got my foreign trade zone. Now I'm open. What does a $400,000 bond mean? It means that you can be fined $400,000. That's what it really means. I mean, Customs has decided that they might need to fine you that amount, so they've set it at $400,000, and they can just snag that money. So I've been in business 25 years. I've never been fined 4 cents. So I'm not going to get fined $400,000, right?
So there's like no national standard for the amount of bond?
No. No, I didn't get fined $400,000. I got fined $1,003,000. I made a mistake. My warehouse is empty. I brought in an old client, Moet and Chandon Champagne, and he brought in 1,000 cases of champagne that had been tax paid in New York that he hadn't been able to sell. He sent them to my foreign trade zone in New York. They got zone-to-zone transferred to my foreign trade zone here. Now they're in zone-restricted status. And he was going to sell them to a duty-free shop in Mexico. The deal fell through. Now it's sitting in my warehouse for 6 months, $350,000 worth of champagne. And it was the only thing I had in my warehouse. And he finally sold it to a duty-free shop in Miami. But by that time, we had decided that we didn't want to do this old paper stuff anymore. We were done with that paper stuff. We were moving into the new era. You know, California was all about doing the new electronic entries, and we didn't want to be trucking ourselves down to the customs and getting things stamped with rubber stamps. We were going to get the new era. So my consultant just happened to be selling his FTZ software. So we linked up with his FTZ software, and we decided to file our first entry of this champagne going to Miami. And we made a mistake. 25 years experience, we made a mistake. We thought we had approval to ship it, and we didn't have approval to ship it. We asked Customs, "Can we please bring it back?" They said no. The penalty is 3 times the value of the. So you're talking $1,303,000. So, but they lowered it to $400,000, which is the amount of our bond. Now you may think that made me sleep a little easier. It actually didn't make me sleep any easier, and it didn't make my surety company sleep any easier either. So we resolved that. I had to appeal my case and make my case, and I did. My lawyer charged me about $30,000 to do that, and we submitted that to Customs, and they lowered it. They didn't have to, and they lowered it to $10,000, and I don't think I've ever paid anything faster in my life. But I learned my lesson. My lesson is, first of all, the lesson I'm teaching you now is you have to be careful what you do in a foreign trade zone. Even if you're an experienced foreign trade zone operator, you have to really make absolutely sure you can't take anything for granted. And that's just the way the game is played. You know, it's a terrific business. I obviously wouldn't have been in it for this long, and I wouldn't be opening new foreign trade zones all over the place, and I wouldn't enjoy being here if I didn't like it. But at the same time, you know, my eye twitches sometimes every time I see a new customer come in, and I keep a close eye on what's going on in my foreign trade zone here. You're not doing your client any favors, and you're not doing yourself any favors if you don't exactly know what you're doing. I have a very good friend who pours big concrete jobs up in Los Angeles. I went crying to him. I said, Customs fined me $400,000. And he's a big Irish guy, ex-football player, and he says, if you come here for sympathy, you're not going to get it. You know, if you're going to be in the game, you got to know. He says, you want to see regulations, I'll show you with concrete. And he said, you've got to be ahead of them. And that's what I am now. I'm ahead of Customs with David's help, and it's not an accident that David is sitting between me and Officer Teruya here, you know, because this is how I like to keep it. Just like this. Yeah, and so I hope I haven't discouraged you. I just want to tell you that if you come into the foreign trade zone business and I can't handle a customer and things come along all the time, I'd be more than happy to. I used to pick up a phone and call you and send them off to you, and so I hope you will find some use in what you've heard today. There's been an awful lot of knowledge up here, not me perhaps, but certainly David and Officer Teruya, and you can see that there are enormous benefits, and I hope you can find something in a foreign trade zone that will be a benefit to you. So that's all I have to say.
You know, I'd like to make a comment on bond amounts. In 1995, they published a public bulletin here, which the port director set the minimum amount for foreign trade zone bonds at $400,000. The foreign trade zone manual in chapter 12 gives us 3 criteria for basically determining bond amount. One is the statutory minimum, which is $50,000. Another methodology is taking 0.5% of the annual inventory value. That means whatever you've had on hand on average all year long in your foreign trade zone, 0.5% of that value is your bond amount, or 10% of the annual duties you paid. Those are the three criteria. One's set by statute or by the port director, the other 0.5% of your inventory value, and third is 10% of your duties paid. Having said that, if you're opening up a new foreign trade zone, we'll take into account that we don't have a history with you. And we'll look at the volume of your business, and we'll be as reasonable as possible in setting the bond amount, because we realize it's difficult to get that bond. I mean, if you're doing $500 million of business a year and you can't afford $1 million bond, something is wrong, you know. So, but if you're doing $1 million a year and we're asking for $400,000, that's tough. I know that. That public bulletin, of course, is pretty old. It's 1995. It's not up for review yet. I don't know when we're going to review it again, but.
So there's no guidance from headquarters on this?
No. There's no guidance from headquarters. And it's different in each port, actually. And as Mr. Spikerman said, the port directors have a lot of discretion in the foreign trade zone regulations, because a lot of it is at the port director's discretion. So, and maybe fortunately, unfortunately, a lot of times they rely on their subject matter experts, which happens to be my team, to
You're it.
yeah, to basically determine what that discretion will be.
So one question, officer, is there an opportunity for the trade or for a business to ask the port director to review that public bulletin, since it has been so long? Or is that not an opportunity that the trade or?
Oh, yes, all you have to do is write a letter.
Well, like the Foreign Trade Association could actually petition to have that changed.
Or have it reviewed, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But be careful what you ask for. Yeah, yeah,
Oh, gee, 400 grand is cheap. We had to bump that up a bit.
yeah, could happen, so.
Okay,
I've got my bond now, so I don't care.
questions from the audience. What questions do you have? Well, let me ask you a question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the type of merchandise allowed into a general purpose zone and the operations that could be conducted there is up to the zone operator to approve.
Yes.
So if you don't like it, you can turn them away.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So people who think, oh yeah, I can just put my stuff in a zone, or I can carry on some crazy refining operation or something, they better look before they leap.
I never accept a new client without, first of all, it's hard to get through me, but if you make it through me, they stop at David. David gets to check them out first. I want to make absolutely sure that we've got everything all set up. I take no risks anymore. And by the way, I want to say something else about 214s. We do not let anyone prepare a 214 for our foreign trade zone. We do our own 214s. We have dealt with too many customs brokers, and I'm talking some big names here who have no idea what they're talking about. We recently had a 4-alarm call for somebody who was sending a shipment into our of liquor into our with no FDA and into our foreign trade zone, and their broker was doing the 214. They had no idea what they were doing, and they'd never checked the FDA thing, and they hadn't done a permit to transfer. They hadn't done anything, and we just absolutely stopped everything dead in its tracks. And because we said, look, we handle this or nobody handles this, and that's all. Because once it gets into your foreign trade zone, if there's been a problem along the way, it's yours now. So we don't let anyone do a 214 except we do them ourselves.
Yeah, Mr. Spikerman is perfectly correct. If you're the foreign trade zone operator and you have a user in the zone, Customs does not hold the user accountable. It's the operator who we will write the liquidated damages and penalties upon. And it's up to the operator to get compensation from the user. So again, if you have a lot of tenants or users in your foreign trade zone, we hold the operator responsible.
Yeah, we had a situation with steel coils from Korea, and I'm sure you'll remember this one. We had the steel coils each weighed about 5,000 pounds, and the duty rate is based on the weight. Well, they weren't importing them in the United States, so I guess they fudged the weight a little bit or something on the documents. I don't know. They didn't care because they figured, well, we're not importing them in the United States anyway, so what's the difference? Well, it matters to customs. And so we had to reweigh, I don't know, like 60 coils at 5,000 pounds each.
That's a big scale.
Yeah, it was a big deal. So, and by the way, that held up my warehouse move. I couldn't move my foreign trade zone from one place to the other until these steel coils got resolved. So, you know, these are all, when they're in your foreign trade zone, they're your problem, and you have to get them resolved.
Yeah, I'm glad Mr. Jones was able to help you on that.
Well, he really did. He really did. So
he was in my office every day on that.
Well, those were tear stains on his jacket, you saw it.
Okay, questions? If not, let's thank Stu Spikerman. Thank you. Okay, next up, we're going to learn about usage-driven sites. You think, what in the heck is that? Well, we can have it explained to you. Our speaker is Michael Schenk, and let me tell you what he does. He's the Customs Logistics Specialist at Yokohama Tire Corporation. I don't think I have those kind of tires on my cars, but what the heck? Okay.
Oh, that's unfortunate, Bruce. Hopefully your next set.
That's the North American sales marketing arm of the Tokyo-based Yokohama Rubber Company. Mike joined Yokohama in 2015 to assist in setting up a new West Coast distribution facility as a foreign trade zone with U.S. Customs. Prior to Yokohama, Mike was involved in the semiconductor high-tech arena, managing customs programs and export compliance. So that's a little bit switch. Okay, from semiconductors to tires. All right.
right.
Exports to foreign trade zone. Mike's been involved in the operations and trade compliance since graduating from the University of California, Santa Cruz with honors, and proudly served in the U.S. Marine Corps from 1999 to 2003. The recipient of several commendations for his service in the Middle East. In his free time, Mike enjoys walking his dog, sports, and local live music. Very good. Okay, Mike, you're on.
Hey, thanks so much for the introduction, Bruce. So hopefully my piece right here can kind of close the circle. We close the circle. We've heard from the attorneys. We've heard from the consultants. We've even heard from the law enforcement. So now you're going to hear from an operator who set up a usage-driven site for a large corporation. I think first things first, I wanted to give you guys a little primer about the company. So if you're not familiar with Yokohama Tires, obviously in the introduction, we're the sales and marketing arm for Tokyo-based Yokohama Rubber. Here in the U.S., Yokohama Tire Corporation, we're in the business of selling tires and distributing tires. We are headquartered just up the street on the other side of John Wayne Airport on the Santa Ana side. We have a couple of U.S.-based manufacturing plants, one producing quite a number of consumer tires in Salem, Virginia, and a new plant addition from a couple years ago that will eventually be ramped up to full capacity. I think we're in the second or third stage of that now, and we're producing quite a number of commercial tires in Mississippi now. So lots of truck and bus tires coming from there. As far as distribution goes, we do have a large facility in Columbus, Ohio. We have a facility in Auburn, Georgia, and just a stone's throw away in Chino, California. That is our West Coast distribution facility and the hub for our network. So that's really the distribution center that receives most of our foreign imports and kind of feeds the rest of our network. And I'll show everybody a map in a minute. We are the largest subsidiary of Yokohama Rubber. As you can see, probably about 20, maybe it's a little bit more now, about 20% or so of the company's sales come from our region. Here's just a map to give you guys a visual of how our distribution network operates. Obviously headquartered in Santa Ana, like I said. We have our Chino facility, which is actually FTZ number 50, site number 45 now. So we went live operating under zone procedures in July of this year. We're quite proud of being able to partner with Customs and actually make that happen. Like I said, 100% of our offshore passenger car tires come through our Chino foreign trade zone and either feed the rest of our network or are distributed to tire companies and other customers on the West Coast, okay? That gives you a little insight into our U.S. operation and our distribution network. You'd ask us, why would you want to become a foreign trade zone? Why would we even have a desire to set up Chino as a foreign trade zone? A couple of factors in play for Yokohama. Obviously, large corporation, it's all about the bottom line and passing that value on to our end users and customers. So really, it's all about cost savings, okay? At the same time, there were some other decisions that led to us shifting our inbound volumes for the consumer replacement offshore through Chino. Like I mentioned, 100% of our consumer replacement, so those are the just regular passenger car tires that are not produced in Salem. We do bring some in from overseas. 100% of those come in through either the ports of LA or Long Beach and go into our foreign trade zone in Chino now, okay? We also set up Chino as a cross-dock distribution model. So like I said, that's the feeder hub for the rest of our network. And just overall, just general focus on reducing costs related to our North American operation and specifically the logistics groups. I think it's no surprise after listening to everybody. Obviously, the potential savings benefits would come from reducing customs duty, related fees and taxes. If you talk to any number of the large tax firms, they would kind of classify that as indirect tax. So if any of the large tax firms approach you about indirect tax, they're really talking about customs related duty and fees and things like that. I think we already talked about the consolidation of merchandise processing fees. So if you're a high volume importer like we are, we're bringing in probably about 7,000 to 8,000 containers through the ports of LA and Long Beach every year. So quite a lot of tires coming through the ports. You can imagine the number of entries and kind of that scalability when we get into this discussion. In any case, very similar to consolidating those merchandise processing fees, from maxing $485 per entry, you're able to consolidate that into one weekly entry and pay the $485 max. So right there, you've got significant savings just being a high volume importer by consolidating that MPF fee. There's also some savings by reducing and consolidating brokerage fees. So if you have a broker that charges you whatever, anywhere between $60 to $120, I think I've seen on the high end, bringing those into a foreign trade zone can possibly eliminate those fees and reduce those associated costs. We did talk about export programs on the 7512 bond process. So if you were to bring in, let's say, products that are subsequently exported, let's say to Mexico, very similar to what Yokohama Tire does, you're able to bring those into the foreign trade zone duty-free. I should say, generally speaking, tires have a duty rate in the U.S. of 4%. Okay, so whatever that valuation is, 4% of that value is what you're going to pay to Uncle Sam. Not directly to Officer Teruya. In any case, you would then export those under bond to Mexico, and we avoid paying the 4% on those that 4% duty on those tires that go to our operation in Mexico. We also have a pretty significant sales and distribution operation in Mexico. One of the kind of hidden things and was a little bit of a selling point for the business case I put together was it also streamlines your operation into your facility. So Yokohama, we did get approved for a direct delivery program, okay? What that means is we don't have to do these 214s prior to moving the goods into the zone. We do it 24 hours after we receive them into the zone, and we leverage our software to facilitate that and things of that nature. I will say we worked pretty closely with Customs to get approved for that. There was some concern because we do bring in actually a pretty small percentage of our overall volume, but we do bring in some tires from China subject to anti-dumping. There's a little bit of hesitation from the group to include those in the direct delivery program, but we were approved, and obviously we were able to show we're compliant. We have an inventory tracking system that accounts for that, and we're not trying to circumvent any of the regulations regarding anti-dumping.
And actually, that process went through our import specialists. And like Mr. Spikerman, those guys who go out, the civilians, they're import specialists, customs import specialists. They do have badge. Well, maybe not anymore, but they have credentials. But yeah, for Yokohama Tires, what happened is there's certain classifications that come up with a concern for anti-dumping and countervailing values, and one of their TUSA numbers came up that way. We went back to the C, or the Centers for Excellence and Expertise, that import specialist to review, and who was in charge of that account, and asked them, is there any concern for Yokohama Tires? Because their lawyer and their consultant sent us a response on saying that what they're actually bringing in, even though it falls under that classification, doesn't qualify for the anti-dumping order. and we sent it back, and the Centers for Excellence agreed, yes, the tires coming in for Yokohama do not fall under that anti-dumping classification, so it was okay, so we could approve it. But if there is a concern, we usually don't approve for direct delivery, but they got it through the efforts of their consultants and their lawyers, which was a learning experience for me too.
So in any case, obviously working for a large company, all of these goals and targets were in line with our, the company's goals last year and this year. I want to talk real briefly about, some of the things that you want to consider putting together a business case. The reason I speak to this, some of you may be working for a company now and you're kind of at this stage. Maybe you're supporting some clients or customers that are at this stage. So I think it's worth a quick mention. Basically, analytics and data drive all the decisions in companies these days. Some of the challenges, some of that data can be fragmented across different systems, and conducting a feasibility study and a business case really needs to be off of that hard data if you're going to, get the attention of, senior management or, who's ever approving these projects, right? I think secondary to that data is really just to conduct a feasibility. And I had mentioned this in one of my comments this morning. There's a lot of questions that you're going to have to sort out as either an operator of the zone or maybe somebody that's contacting an operator of a general purpose zone and utilize their zone instead of setting up a usage-driven site. It really depends on, what your commodities are, what your business model is, what your goals are, and what really makes sense to your organization, right? Are you a mom and pop, startup, importing, 2 containers a month from China where, it makes sense, to go with a general purpose zone and contact somebody like Stu, or, are you a large company bringing in 7,000 containers a year and you have a facility already that can handle those volumes? So those are the kind of things that you want to iron out kind of just in an overall feasibility, right? It's a rough review just to determine, one, if it makes sense, and two, what are the angles you want to approach? What really makes sense, right? And then at that point, I mean, really, that's like the pre-planning stages to any like business case. When you get into building the business case, especially for a large organization like Yokohama, you want to consider all the stakeholders that are involved in this. It's one thing if you're contracting a general purpose zone and you can handle most of the stuff yourself. With a large corporation, you're dealing with IT, you're dealing with your customs department, you're dealing with your logistics department. Security is a big factor, especially when you start talking with customs. That's going to be a large focus. So if you have somebody in charge of facilities or security for your site, they're obviously a key stakeholder. How about all your other providers? How about your dray carriers that are moving the freight, from the port to your facility? Customs brokers, just basically every business unit in your company if you're working for a large company. So in any case, you want to build a solid case, and you're going to look at all the savings potential, like I mentioned on the previous slide, versus all the costs. One of the challenging things, besides some of the compliance stuff that Stu was speaking to, and I'm sure once you get into more commodities and more clients, I mean that risk grows exponentially. Some of those costs you might not be able to quantify them, right? Or they might not be known until you actually get into a feasibility and start building a case. What about resources? Do you actually have to hire somebody to administer this or coordinate it? We talk about hiring consultants. Maybe you have to involve the attorneys. All those things can be cost drivers that you should try to develop into a business case. Okay. I think also very important from the compliance side of things is reviewing all of your processes to make sure that your processes incorporate additional, or maybe you don't have them already. You've got to have the right internal controls in place in these processes to make sure you are compliant with those customs regs. Okay. all that was just kind of a primer, just some background about Yokohama, a little bit about how you'd start to put this together from a planning perspective. And now I want to speak really towards the application process. Before I get into that, just a couple of things. I mean, I mentioned earlier, it's really what makes sense, for your company. One of the things that Yokohama that we did not expect was this bond piece. And that was a little bit surprising. And this wasn't, I get customs guidelines and the directives. There's actually a questionnaire survey, five simple questions where they ask you about this, right? What was your import volume value last year, for the last 12 calendar months? Everything that the customs officer already spoke about. We ran into a couple of snags when we actually reached out to the surety companies, where whatever that amount was, they wanted 100% collateral posted. So Stu, you're not alone. I mean, I said the same thing. Told the first surety that told me that, get lost. I'll contact somebody else. I've been working with these guys for years and taking out different bond amounts for years. And one of the driving factors was that the anti-dumping. I mean, if you have any imports either going into a zone or outside of a zone, just on a consumption entry, there's a large focus where they want that covered in case there's liquidated damages for that anti-dumping. And it really all goes back there. I don't know if everybody's familiar with this catfish case, but years ago, I mean, there were all kinds of importers for catfish, and the anti-dumping cases came down the pike about these catfish. So they all tried to unload all this and bring in as many as they could. And what happened is they slapped the anti-dumping tariffs on these catfish imports, and everybody that had anything in transit basically said it's not even worth us importing it. So basically all these containers of catfish were piling up at all the U.S. ports, and it's not as simple as dumping them overboard or something. So I think that's when a lot of the sureties took a hit, and there were claims against those bonds to cover the duties and fees owed on those catfish, and then probably also supported some of the cleanup effort, which is probably a fortunate thing, right?
Something fishy about this.
So anyway, there's some history behind all that, and I agree. It's some of that is a little bit challenging to navigate, especially until you actually get into it and you start some of those discussions. So I just throw it out there that it's hard to quantify some of this stuff. It's hard to really foresee all those costs until you actually kind of get into this feasibility study. And I'd encourage everybody as kind of a starting point to kind of look in that and start mapping out what your goals are and what models might make sense for you. Speaking of that, we talked about software out there for large volume importers. They have software companies that support this, that will interface with your inventory control systems and directly with U.S. Customs. So, they facilitate all of these declarations. I mean, at the end of the day, it's really not a one-for-one trade-off. You're not trading your 7501 entry, for some kind of foreign trade zone entry. You're actually signing up for, a couple extra steps there, even though it streamlines the process, the processing and the flow of your goods. You still have to cut a PTT and provide the correct information to get that authorization to move the goods to the zone. You still have to, submit a 214 upon admission to the zone, even if you're approved for direct delivery, and you're still obligated to submit that weekly estimate and the associated entry. So those are things that you want to look at depending on what makes sense for your company. Okay. This is where I'll talk about the application process a little bit. And first of all, I'd directly thank the Port of Long Beach for working through it with us. They were actually a pleasure to work with and made the process pretty easy, at least the stuff we had to deal with for the grantee. So obviously for our zone, grantee is the Port of Long Beach. And it was kind of interesting. At that point in time, we actually had more container volume going through the LA side. And Gilbert would call me every once in a while and kind of question that. And I just said, you might see that change with the alliances and different things. But I think what we've seen recently is that's kind of leveled out where, I don't want to say it's equal, but we're bringing in quite a bit more through Long Beach now. Obviously, we're the operator at our Chino facility. The first thing in the application process is really to get that grantee operators agreement nailed down, okay? It's pretty basic agreement, contract, detailing the permission granted to the operator to activate the facility. Basically, you're signing up to maintain a standard of operations that would go hand in hand with your operating procedures. Basically, that you're going to operate the zone compliantly and you're not going to increase any liability or risk for the port. It also details some things like the right of entry, any type of improvements that you want to make to the zone, and also record keeping. So a lot of the things in the grantee operators agreement really just kind of echo what you have to sign up for with U.S. Customs anyway. You're going to follow the rules, and they want a solid agreement that you're going to follow the rules, right? There is a minor administrative charge that the grantee kind of charges just to cover their administrative expenses. And then I just stated here, you guys just want to ensure that the operator is aware and agrees to operate a compliant zone within their jurisdiction. So basically, Chino, I think, is like 52 miles from the Port of LA or Long Beach down the corridor. So we're within that jurisdiction. We talked about it a little bit. Sorry, that's a little bit small. Don't try to read that. I put a link on there to the enforcement page where you can find all these applications are publicly available. Like everybody mentioned earlier, I think there was a large focus in trying to reduce the cumbersome nature of the application, right? Obviously the FTZ board and Customs wants to try to promote foreign trade zones. They don't want you to have to go through too much red tape or spend too much money, for say attorneys to have to decipher the application for you. Although there's a number of attorneys and trade consultants that would gladly help you with that application, but I'd like to just give you some insight into how simple the application actually looks. In any case, website, you can take a look at the applications for yourself. This might be a little bit difficult to read, but I'll walk you through it. Basically, the application that we submitted for designation, pretty simple. It's 9 basic questions. Obviously, we signed up for a usage-driven site, give the address to the location, you give a little bit of detail about the area and the grantee, give our proposed acreage for the site, which is actually just under 31.5 acres. So there's a 500,000 square foot warehouse out in Chino. So you can imagine that, 500,000 square feet. You need a little golf cart to drive across it. Obviously, Yokohama Tire Corporation is the operator of this. Our planned activities are pretty limited to distribution and storage. We do quite a lot of distributing from our facility, but it's probably nothing like what Stu's had to deal with some of the other regulations, let's say chemicals or something like that. Obviously, the zoning is it's zoned for manufacturing and office space, but you just have to they just want to know what it's zoned for, and then we just confirm that FTZ designation is not a precondition to us like at that site. We were already at that site for a couple of years or a year prior to us setting up the foreign trade zone. So this was just kind of like an add-on to the facility. So basically, Yokohama outgrew the previous facility. They were headquartered in Fullerton, and there was like a warehouse on the other half of it. A couple of my coworkers that work there, they could tell you it's like, smelling tire rubber all day at the office because you're right next to the warehouse. And basically, we just outgrew that capacity, and there was a whole, business case for us to move the office. So we moved the headquarters from Fullerton to Santa Ana, and then the warehousing piece out to Chino, and then that's where I came in to set up the foreign trade zone. So as you can see, the application process, at least for the designation, is pretty straightforward. There are some terms in there that you might not be familiar with where, a consultant could probably help out. A consultant could also help you package it and, get it to the right people at the board to kind of steward it through, if you will. A couple of things that go into the application process, and I don't have a slide for this, but I'll just leave the map up while I talk about this. I think one of the important things that was mentioned earlier, and one of the things that was very important to Yokohama, was to set up those pre-meetings or those pre-security reviews with U.S. Customs. A couple of members of Officer Teruya's team came out, actually visited the facility a couple of times, and really appreciated just the partnership with them and the ease working through getting our site set up. Basically, it was just a security review where they're walking through our entire facility. We're talking about adequate camera coverage. Do you have documented policies and procedures for signing in visitors coming into the facility? Do your truck drivers have free access to the docks? Is there well-lit areas outside where merchandise could be stored? We have these large off-the-road tires that, we actually have inventory locations outside. Obviously, perimeter fencing, barbed wire. We have on one side of our facility is like a 30-foot brick wall. I'll just speak to a minute about, kind of partnering with Customs to get through some of those security elements. There was some initial guidance from Customs where they wanted us to put up some barbed wire in the back alongside one of our fences, and unfortunately we went down that path, and there were some local city ordinances that kind of prevented us in doing that. And it's like, geez, well, what do we do now, right? I mean, Customs wants this. We can't really do it by local city ordinance. And when we met with Customs for the second time, we kind of talked through all the different contingencies, and we said, well, look, we're not going to be able to put up, an extra string of barbed wire up there, but if you really do look at it, there's another fence and it kind of butts up next to the golf course. It's a private golf course. It's not like everybody's playing on it all day long. And then there were a couple other factors. We have, essentially 360-degree high-definition camera coverage, as well as it being a very well-lit facility, and the boundary walls are, 30 feet tall. So they kind of worked through that with us. They felt that the security was adequate even without us being able to, string up some more barbed wire. The other security improvement that we went through, we have a small section of the warehouse. You can see it on this map. So the blue outline is basically our property boundary line. The red is really what we designated for activation. And you'll see that block in the corner of our warehouse kind of punched out. We have like a small, it's a cage. It's a caged-in area. And we do some, we bring in some test tires in there. Occasionally some marketing stuff will get in there. And there was a little bit of a concern about those goods being commingled with some of our privileged freight in the facility. So I think we put up like another 3 feet of wire and kind of moved some of our racks and things 3 feet away from there just to make sure we're consistent with Customs directives and their security review. So in any case, I mean, Customs will work through things with you, whether it be the bond amount. We actually talked to them about revising our bond amount too, because when we set up the facility as a foreign trade zone, we said, well, wait a minute, everything that's current, all of the inventory that's in that facility has already been cleared through customs. So there's no duty liability on those products, and it's going to take us probably a year to bleed through, that domestic inventory to where we're actually bringing in more foreign. So they worked with us on some of those numbers and some of that review. So all I'm trying to say is, they're going to be reasonable. And I felt that the team was absolutely reasonable in helping us set up the zone. It's really a partnership.
And it's all about the fact that all the regulations state that the port director has discretion, and as the subject matter experts, we exercise that discretion. And we were setting up Yokohama Tires. Again, that's another instance where whenever he got a call from Mr. Jones would be in my office again. But he's a good guy. And he worked hard on the Yokohama, and that cable. Whoa. So.
And we definitely appreciated them working through that. In any case, as part of that application process, I mean, like I said, it's a pretty short form. You fill it out, you go through that security review. One of the things you'll attach to that application is a map and a boundary area of your facility. So, just expect that. I mean, you're going to have to probably, pull something off of Google Maps or something like that.
Yeah, the facilities map is very important. Whatever you designate as your foreign trade zone area is what we're going to review and approve. If you just designate the building itself, that's all we're going to approve. So if you park foreign trade zone merchandise in containers in your yard, and your yard is not approved as part of your foreign trade zone, you're in violation.
Yep.
Once you dray your goods up to your facility, it has to be in the foreign trade zone, which means you have to devan it right away into your foreign trade zone. Now, if, as in this diagram, you designate part of your yard as your foreign trade zone, then you may be allowed to store goods in that yard. Having said that, we have to make sure that that yard is secure. In other words, you can't have a yard that you're sharing with other facilities. So if you're in a warehouse complex where you're sharing parking space or container parking space with other companies, and there's no way for you to secure your own containers, there's no way we can designate or agree to have your yard as part of your foreign trade zone. So there's a lot of things to consider, but again, we'll work with you. If there's a way we can work it out, up on getting these activations approved, our job is to provide a service, to work with you to make it as easy, and if there's any way possible we can make it work, we'll try to help you make it work. It's when we get to the compliance part where we have to enforce regulations where we may not be so nice. But up until then, we'll help you as much as we can.
Speaking of compliance with the regulations, one of the things that was probably the greatest concern for me or for the company, was making sure that we're submitting, appropriate entries and declarations. So as part of that business case, and one of the costs associated with us rolling out a foreign trade zone was the selection of software process. So like I was mentioning, there are, specialized foreign trade zone softwares that will interface with your inventory systems currently, and will also interface with customs, so you can kind of automate this declaration process. But I'll tell you, the software companies, they're all over the board. You have some probably on the low end, bare bones. It'll get the job done, right, without the bells and whistles. Maybe it doesn't look so great. And then on the other side, I mean, you've got very robust softwares that will not just manage foreign trade zones, they'll manage other parts of your compliance programs, whether it be, FDA declarations or, any other type of compliance things. And the look and feel, I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, it looks like, web-based and, everything you can imagine with, the current software out there. So in any case, I'd I'd kind of just throw some caution out there. If you feel like, you do have the volumes and you're setting up a usage-driven site, really look at all the different softwares because, the functionality capabilities, they're not all the same. It's really apples to oranges. In any case, I see Shri back there from GT Connect. Actually, that was actually one of the software guys that I spoke with. I ended up selecting a different company, but no hard feelings, and I was, happy to meet Shri along the way. In any case, at this point in time, you've pretty much got your designation from Commerce. You've had a pre-security review from Customs. Okay, you've made those necessary improvements, and okay, you've selected a software. You've got that, piece of the project running. What's really left is actually just to get the final approval and go live. And that's really what, this last slide is about. The application's complete. You've done the security review. Customs has issued the concurrence letter to Commerce. The Commerce application is complete, and they're going to approve you. So a lot of this is, it's really on the operator to ensure compliance of the zone operation. Customs is going to help you as much as they can up front. The grantee will help you as much as they can up front, whether it be hooking you up with the right contacts or, getting you to the right, web page, whatever, or talking through the situation with you. But at the end of the day, just like Stu mentioned, the onus is on the operator to ensure you're running a compliant zone operation. And, as I said it earlier, as part of that application, you're telling Customs that in your application. You certify that you're going to run a compliant zone, and so basically they're approving your activation and the board's activation based on all that information that you've provided them. But really, at the end of the day, however you set it up, it's got to be what makes sense for your business, and you've got to just review it and kind of make that decision. And if you can't do it on your own, obviously there's consultants out there, David, and a number of different software companies as well. That's pretty much it. Unless anybody has any questions, I just wanted to thank everybody again for coming out. Actually, here's a shot of Gilbert and Kathleen in front of one of our off-the-road tires. Actually, that's in the yard at one of our facilities. And
Is that
I know there's a couple of pictures of Officer Teruya's team with some of these tires as well. But in any case, if anybody has any questions or thoughts, definitely open to that, or feel free to reach out even after the event concludes. I'd be happy to just talk through it with anybody.
Okay, questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Well, let me make a clarification here. A usage-driven zone or a traditional site frame zone is your basic general purpose zone. A subzone is defined by regulation as a type of foreign trade zone which cannot be accommodated within the traditional site framework model. And that's called an alternate site framework model. So it's not that if your warehouse operation, the type of zone you want to have, can be accommodated within the traditional site or a traditional site frame or usage-driven or general purpose zone, that's the way you can go. It's only those operations that cannot be accommodated within that framework that qualify for subzone, which is why subzones don't have a geographic limit. So if a grantee can accommodate your zone within the traditional site frame or within their zone project, then a subzone may be the way to go through that grantee, because it's not, can't be accommodated within the traditional site framework. But having said that, that's all incumbent upon whether or not customs can administer the zone, and at that point it becomes customs discretion. So if your subzone is, like I said, going to be in Palm Springs, we can't really administer that effectively. There's no way that my people can go out there and conduct their compliance reviews, do their site work within a reasonable amount of time to administer that. So
Plus it's beyond 60 miles.
it's beyond, well, subzones don't have to be within
Oh, okay.
60 miles.
Yeah.
It just has to be at our discretion. But from the field office perspective, what they've kind of told us is that for subzones, we may extend it a little bit beyond 60 miles, but not much past that. It's just too far, and we're not able to accommodate that. And so going with your grantees is your best bet, and using a traditional site framework for your usage-driven general purpose zone. It depends on what kind of commodity and what kind of operation you're going to run. No.
Actually, let me clarify. Going back about 10 years ago, traditional site framework is what every grantee or zone project had. Over the past 10 years, grantees have evolved from a traditional site framework where it was a lengthy process to designate your property for the general purpose zone. General purpose zones can be private importers with their own warehouse. General purpose zones can be public warehouses that accommodate multiple users. So a general purpose zone, as in its terminology, it was for general use of the foreign trade zone. Subzones are ideally for those unique situations or for very specialized high-level manufacturing facilities that are traditionally outside that general purpose zone or zone project area. So you see subzones being utilized for high-level manufacturing or for remote locations within the region. So in the case of the Port of Long Beach, they applied for alternative site framework, which is a comprehensive look to evolve the general purpose zone project by making it more approachable and less expensive for importers or for operators to become a foreign trade zone at a much quicker pace and at a much less costlier pace, meaning that you can become a foreign trade zone now in an average of 3 to 4 months or 6 months at the most by going through a very quick designation process, as you had suggested, and then also going through that activation process. So for most companies that are participating in the foreign trade zone, they're going to use the general purpose zone as their form of the foreign trade zone. It's for those companies like IKEA or like remote location zones or facilities that want to try to access the program where they're not directly in line with the port of entry or the foreign trade zone project. So you see things like oil refineries and so forth will use the subzone project, but it's actually better for you as a manufacturer or as a distributor to use the general purpose zone. There's more flexibility, it's less costly, there's a faster process to getting approved and so forth. The subzone is for those outliers more so.
Yeah, and if you're going to be primarily a manufacturer, you can use that and become a production zone, or you can designate yourself a non-production zone, which is basically your distribution center type operation.
That might be a stretch.
No, not really, because then that trucker's site would have to be activated as a foreign trade zone also. Yeah, it would be a different kind of operation. I don't know what you. If it's non-cleared foreign freight and you're taking it to another facility, technically once once you file your permit to transfer, it has to go from the port of entry to the foreign trade zone, typically.
Yeah, there are some unique circumstances though where, for example, if I'm a subzone and I'm a manufacturer and I have other processes to be done that are not in my zone, I can actually extend my activation and my bond at another facility, which would grow my, my square footage that may be at someone else's facility. Again, you need to work with customs and make sure they're comfortable with what your commodities are, what those processes are. There's some risk there for the operator as well, in that they're now responsible for another facility that's being managed by an extension of your company to provide services. I don't know that the trucking situation will work as well, but for outside processing, for example, if I'm a manufacturer and I need to have my goods specifically heat treated at a nearby location and they're only heat treating my goods, then there's a pathway sometimes to have that activated under me as the operator to do different things like that. So there are some things that have been done around the country. It's more specific with manufacturers and outside processing, not so much with a distribution operator wanting to utilize a trucking facility to hold containers until I'm ready to receive them.
Yeah. Now, the permit to transfer process is pretty straightforward from one point to another point.
Yes.
The inbound process is another thing, though. There is regulation out there that says that if, let's say, you're trucking something from Miami to LA, and the trucking company wants to temporarily stage a container to consolidate more merchandise into their trailer for the trip to LA, they can temporarily store that merchandise in their facility under the trucker's bond. It has to be under the trucker's bond. It's not under the foreign trades, but it's still under bond. But that's under an inbound movement, an IT or a T&E from one port to another port, not within port movements. Any within port movements is permit to transfer, and we don't allow to go from the port to a holding place, then to the final destination.
The other thing that you might want to just be aware of is some of these processes, they have like a timeline. So, from whatever it is, time that the vessel arrives, you've got a certain amount of time to get that on a 214, or else it's going to go to general order.
Yeah.
Right? And, end up in some customs warehouse somewhere.
Actually, the general order, the lay order time is 15 days on dock, and then 10 days to get it to a facility. So 25 days total. You have to have some kind of admission document filed, either an entry or a 214 or a inbound document 7512. Some kind of document filed. Otherwise, yes, it'll go to one of our general order warehouses, then you'll pay those fees too.
Okay, other questions? Did we answer your question, sir? Okay, other questions? All this time I thought a subzone was a zone where they manufacture submarines. I guess it could be.
Before we move on, I just also wanted to thank a couple people in the audience for coming out to support the speaking engagement today, but also would thank them for just all their support on setting up the foreign trade zone. So Brett Schindler from Yokohama is here, as well as Joan Boonchu. Brett is our senior manager of logistics planning, and Joan is our import manager and handles quite a bit of this backlash from since we've set up the foreign trade zone, whether it be dealing with PTTs or anything else. And just wanted to thank you guys for coming out today, and thanks for everything with the foreign trade zone as well.
Okay, and we want to thank Michael
Thank
for
you.
coming out today. Thank you, Mike. Okay, now we get a return engagement. Okay, David's going to be our cleanup hitter today and talk about manufacturing in a foreign trade zone. David?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So manufacturing within the foreign trade zone. It's uniquely different than just managing a foreign trade zone for distribution. There's a lot more that goes into the process and making the decisions. And so this is going to be a presentation that's going to give you some very basic overviews of what that manufacturing slash FTZ participation would look like. Maybe one of the first things before I begin to start with is it's important as a manufacturer that you understand what customs definition and what the Foreign Trade Zone Board's definition of manufacturing is. For you and I, putting something together, assembling something, we might consider that manufacturing. But for U.S. Customs and the Foreign Trade Zone Board, manufacturing, which by the way is not called manufacturing, it's called production. So they've changed the terminology to production. Means you're taking one commodity, you bringing it into the zone with one tariff classification, and you're significantly changing that part or that piece to a different tariff classification. So for example, if I bring in a shirt and then I put some type of picture on that shirt and I cut off the sleeves and then I put holes in the front of the shirt, it looks like a shirt when it comes out. It doesn't significantly change the classification. It may change the 12th level of that classification, but it's not a significant tariff change. Customs and the Foreign Trade Zone Board are usually looking for that tariff change to change chapters, not to change just some of the details about the commodity. So for example, I bring in a steering wheel and I turn it into a car. That has a significant change. That is considered production. But if it's just assembly or manipulation, those are not definitions for manufacturing or for production in U.S. Customs eyes or in the Foreign Trade Zone Board's eyes. So that's what they are looking for when they're approving you for manufacturing, to understand that you're truly manufacturing goods. So what are some of the benefits that manufacturing in a foreign trade zone offers? Manufacturing or processing of goods in a foreign trade zone offers opportunities to defer, reduce, and eliminate those duties. So again, it's very similar to some of the benefits you see in a foreign trade zone that's doing storage and distribution. The key difference there, though, is the reduce or the elimination. I can actually reduce my duty or eliminate my duty while manufacturing it without having to export the goods, without necessarily using the weekly entry program. Again, like I showed in my previous presentation, I bring in car parts and then that have a duty rate of 5%, and then I create a finished product, which is an automobile, that has a duty rate of 2.5%. I've reduced that my duty in the zone by 50%. That's reduction. I'm still able then to enter it into commerce and deliver it to my clients here in the United States. So that's an example of reduction. How can I eliminate my duty in a foreign trade zone without exporting the goods? A very similar process. I bring in an automobile part, or I'm sorry, let's change the example to vacuum cleaner parts. Those vacuum cleaner parts have a duty rate of 5%. Once I turn it into a vacuum cleaner, for hypothetically, that vacuum cleaner has a duty rate of 0%. I've now eliminated my duty in a foreign trade zone through a manufacturing process. I'm still going to clear customs on it, but I'm going to pay zero duty now because my duty rate went from 5% to 0%. This is an example of where manufacturing eliminates my duty without exporting it. I'm still going to clear it and enter the commerce. So this is some of the benefits you see in manufacturing in a foreign trade zone that you don't see in a distribution scenario of a foreign trade zone where I'm just storing and distributing goods. Manufacturing is also an FTZ that promotes the creation of jobs. So in a foreign trade zone, one of the big stipulations for manufacturing is being able to show public interest. I need to be able to do something in my manufacturing zone that's going to create a benefit for the American people or for the United States. If I'm displacing jobs or I'm hurting the domestic industry, this no longer creates a public interest, and in those cases, you're not allowed to be a foreign trade zone. So it's very unique in manufacturing. You have to have a public interest, something that's going to benefit the economy or benefit the people working for the company you're at, to benefit the United States. So there's also financial and logistical advantages as well. Duty reduction advantages. I kind of fell into this already and already went into a lot of detail. So the ability to bring raw materials and components into my FTZ, manufacture them into a finished good, where I'm going to see a reduction in duty is one example. the ability to eliminate duty or to eliminate duty on scrap and waste. So during my manufacturing process, while I'm making those auto parts into an automobile, I may find that I'm having to trim some of those auto parts to fit into the vehicle. I'm having to do some type of heat treatment that may cause some of the product to evaporate. Or I may be creating some scrap or waste during that process. That scrap and waste, which is still part of those original components that are subject to duty, but now that they're scrap and waste, they've now changed from a classification of an auto part to scrap, which is a different classification, and then scrap is duty-free in the foreign trade zone. And
David, would that also apply to parts that maybe fail to test or get broken in the process?
Absolutely. Yeah. So again, if you have quality control problems with some of those parts where they appeared to be quality parts, but then once you started implementing them in your manufacturing process, they just did not adhere to some of the stringent requirements during that manufacturing process. All of that allows you to then file, either call it scrap if it's truly scrap and waste, and then it's duty free, or I can file a 216 with U.S. Customs to say these parts or these pieces of parts that don't truly qualify for scrap, but they also cannot be used in my manufacturing process or sold to my clients. So I'm going to then have these destroyed by sending them to a scrap dealer or to a destruction facility to have those parts melted so they can no longer be used. And then I can eliminate my duty as well.
Yeah. The one thing you have to be aware of with scrap and waste, there's true scrap and waste, and then there's recoverable scrap and waste.
Yes.
The recoverable scrap and waste is dutiable.
Yes.
But at a much reduced rate usually.
Exactly. Yeah, and so we actually have a client that goes through this process where they cut up pieces of titanium, and so the actual scrap they reclassify as scrap, but the other stuff, which they call remnants or recoverable scrap, they actually have that melted so they can avoid the duty completely. But again, you have those opportunities in a manufacturing process, and to be able to see savings, financial savings, by eliminating or reducing that duty as well.
David, what about, let's say, rubber tires that are ground up and then go onto the playground or the local high school track?
And so this is where you work with your import specialist very closely, because customs interpretation on what is truly considered scrap is definitely unique from commodity to commodity. So for example, if I take a pair of jeans, customs considers cutting up those pair of jeans so they can never be worn as a pair of jeans, as now it's considered scrap. But in the case of your example, there are other things you can use rubber for. There are other things you can use pieces of titanium for. So it's, again, understanding how classifiable that it can be called scrap, or it can be used for other commodities. So in your case, you may want to reclassify it so you can use it for playgrounds, or you may decide, I don't want to do that. I can't call this truly scrap or waste. It's a recoverable scrap. I now need to melt it or figure out what the import specialist with U.S. Customs determines to be able to call it scrap. It may be in doing some more significant things to that scrap so that it's truly unrecoverable scrap and becomes duty-free. So this is where you work really well with your FTZ unit with U.S. Customs, and then you also work with that import specialist to make sure that you're following all those compliance requirements. Scrap for jeans versus scrap for tires has different requirements. Then there's also the ability to reduce or eliminate high duty rates on raw materials and components. So again, this is just kind of reiterating what we said before, and the ability to incorporate duty deferral and weekly entry, as well as exports for duty elimination. So just because you're an FTZ manufacturer doesn't mean you don't get to benefit from some of those other things we've talked about with distribution. So I'm able to bring my parts in, manufacture it into a finished product to reduce my duty. I then can keep it in my foreign trade zone to defer that duty, and then I can eventually export that and eliminate the duty if I sell it to a customer outside the U.S. Or if I sell it to a customer in the U.S., I can then benefit from the weekly entry program. I can also use privileges like direct delivery as well on the front end. So manufacturing is where you really get to start to use all of these pieces of benefits that we've been talking about and really maximize those benefits. where in distribution and storage of goods, you're not going to realize the manufacturing benefits, but you will realize the distribution and storage benefits we've talked about. And then other benefits include daily admission benefits and direct delivery, like I mentioned. So again, the more volume, the more activity you have, then the other benefits also can play into maximizing your benefits in the manufacturing FTZ. So what are some of these examples of manufacturing, otherwise known as production? So like we talked about before, taking parts of an automobile, turning it into a finished automobile. This also plays into taking crude oil and being able to manipulate or manufacture that crude oil into jet fuel or gasoline or other types of forms of oil or gasoline that can be used in the United States or abroad. And then there's also furniture. One example of this would be a company that we have worked with in the past that imported fabric and wooden legs into the United States from Asia, brought it into their foreign trade zone, manufactured it into a piece of furniture by taking a coil that brought it into their zone. They did a partial manufacture to the process, and then they exported it to a maquiladora in Mexico, where then the final stage manufacturing took place. They then qualified for NAFTA, brought the goods back into the U.S. under a NAFTA status, so everything was duty-free. So they were using a free trade zone in Asia, they were using a foreign trade zone in the U.S., and they were using a maquiladora program in Mexico to qualify for NAFTA. So there was no duties or taxes paid in any one of those programs, but they were able to maximize those benefits through manufacturing. So this is yet another example of how the creativity of the foreign trade zone program can be used to maximize your benefits in your supply chain. Once you've looked at this program as a manufacturer and you say, God, this sounds really great, I see a lot of possibilities of becoming a foreign trade zone for manufacturing, it's important that you do that analysis. Like you had talked about before, that analysis becomes even more key in a manufacturing process because there's more moving parts. There's more components to understand. It's understanding that scope of activity in the foreign trade zone as well, which is another thing that you have to adhere to for compliance purposes with the Foreign Trade Zone Board and U.S. Customs. If your scope of authority is to turn an automobile parts into an automobile, and then halfway through the year you decide, you know what, I'm going to start doing this with vacuum cleaners now. Well, your scope of authority only allows you to do it for automobiles. So that vacuum cleaner scope of authority is something you'd have to go back to Customs and the Foreign Trade Zone Board to get approval of. So it's important that you understand what that scope of authority is before you start the process, because that's involved in gaining that activation and designation with U.S. Customs and the Foreign Trade Zone Board. Understanding your financial and logistical benefits. Many times you can work with a consultant or work with a grantee to do a cost-benefit analysis. Find out what it's going to cost you from a logistical point of view, an operational point of view, and a financial point of view, what those savings are going to create for you as well. Many times companies will come back and say, well, I'm going to save $100,000 a year, let's move forward. But their costs in manufacturing may find that it's going to cost them $75,000 a year to manage the process. Well, then that means a $25,000 savings probably isn't worth the headache and all of the additional things you have to go through. So it's important that you go through that analysis or feasibility or case study to make sure you're accounting for all of your costs as well as all of your benefits that the program offers. One of the other things that impacts manufacturers is their branding. If I'm branding myself to say that I am making everything here in the United States and everything is U.S. made in my manufacturing process, and that's part of my selling component to sell to my customers, and now I want to outsource everything, use a foreign trade zone to manufacture those goods still here in the U.S., I can no longer call it a U.S. made product because a lot of those components are coming from other countries, and so now maybe it's assembled in the U.S. or it's partially made in the U.S. That may change my branding, which may then change my selling point of who my customer is or how much I can sell the goods for. So it's important that a manufacturer understands all of those components because they can all play a part in their foreign trade zone participation. And then again, your supply chain. And a manufacturer, their supply chain is a lot of times much larger and much more complicated than a typical importer that's importing finished goods for distribution. Your supply chain goes all the way back to where those raw materials are coming from, who's making those raw materials, and then how they're being transported to your zone, how you're manufacturing that product, and then how you're delivering that product. So there's an impact there to consider as well. So essentially, how does a manufacturer's application process change from what was explained to us earlier? You're still going to have to designate like you would in the general purpose zone or you would in a subzone. You're still going to go through the activation process with U.S. Customs. But then there's a third step that you have to encounter, and that's production authority. That's going back to the Foreign Trade Zone Board and U.S. Customs and saying, I need authority to actually manufacture or produce goods in my zone, and I need to understand what that process is. If it's a manufacturing process that's already been done in a foreign trade zone, then it's typically 120 days. It's an administrative review by the Foreign Trade Zone Board and concurrence by U.S. Customs, and now I have my production authority. But if I'm doing something that's never been done in a foreign trade zone before, it's something that could be controversial, then it may require me to go through public hearings, go through a public Federal Register process with the Foreign Trade Zone Board that may take 6 to 8 months to now gain that production authority. So again, these are some of the outlying things that you see in manufacturing that you have to consider. Most companies that are manufacturing in a foreign trade zone are taking all of these things into account. It's a longer process. It's sometimes a more costly process, but then also your savings and your financial benefits are exponentially larger as well. So it's definitely an advantage to be in a foreign trade zone, but it's important to understand all of those factors on what you're getting yourself into and how to manage through that process and then manage your compliance of the program as well. Well, when you're a manufacturer, you can actually be a manufacturer in a general purpose zone, which means you have to be within the 60 miles or 90 minutes. You would request for production authority that has to be renewed. I believe it's every year by the Foreign Trade Zone Board under the general purpose zone. Or if you're a subzone, you can also get manufacturing authority, and then you're not having to adhere to that 60-mile radius, but you still must adhere to what resources U.S. Customs has and what they're able to manage and enforce. So, for example, like the officer was saying, if I'm out in Palm Springs, even though I'm a subzone, I'm still too far away for Customs to be able to navigate their resources to enforce that program. So they want you to be a little bit closer. So, it all really comes back to working with your Customs officers and with your grantee to find the most equitable way to manage the zone and then maximize those benefits. Sure. You mean the one up in IKEA? Oh, in Las Vegas. I would probably defer to Customs on that. I know that they've been interested, and now they've considered it, but I don't know if it's been successful.
That's the battery factor.
I think they were actually published in the register.
Yes, I believe that there is a geographical description of the port limits for the Port of Las Vegas, and the Port Director of Las Vegas is the one who will oversee that zone in Las Vegas. So if it's within the port, within 60 miles of the port boundaries of Las Vegas, then they would qualify for activation in Las Vegas. We are the service port for Las Vegas, so more than likely they will be calling us for advice on how to do the activation, and my officers will be giving them advice and telling them what documents they need to review and what other considerations they have to take into effect. Maybe I can finagle a trip out there just to oversee the activation, but no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
But no, I
Take a
haven't.
gamble on that.
But but otherwise we have this. I've heard nothing about that activation yet. I don't believe that they have. We haven't seen the grantee request yet. and that would be Clark County. Clark County is the grantee up there, and that's Zone 244, I believe.
Actually, it's the Las Vegas Global Economic Authority is the grantee that represents Clark County. You're right, yeah. So what are some of the keys to a successfully manufacturing in a foreign trade zone? One of the keys that I would really recommend is training, is making sure, especially in a manufacturing process, as well as any other FTZ participation, is that you have the adequate training beforehand and then the concurrent training while you're managing the zone project. Self-auditing or third-party auditing. The best thing an FTZ operator and an FTZ manufacturer can do is to proactively prepare themselves for customs visits, for customs compliance, by doing regularly training, but also regular auditing to prepare themselves of what that compliance audit from customs is going to look like, and testing themselves to make sure they're prepared for it. As consultants, they provide those services. And then there's many operators that will create in-house quality control programs to self-audit themselves as well, to further prepare themselves for compliance requirements. So by doing that, that just better prepares yourself for when that visit with U.S. Customs does come, and that you're prepared for it and you can anticipate a successful compliance review. Secondly, especially in a manufacturing facility, you want to have a strong inventory control system that's in line with foreign trade zone compliance requirements. So not any inventory control system out there is in compliance with what Customs will require. For example, one of the requirements by U.S. Customs is that you have to be able to identify the status of your goods in your inventory control system, by saying, okay, these goods are domestic versus these goods are non-privileged foreign, these goods are zone restricted. If your inventory control system can do that, that's great, and you meet a lot of those compliance requirements. Most inventory control systems out there don't have that capability. And then this is, like you had said, where companies will then integrate with the foreign trade zone software, like GT Connect in the back, to integrate with their existing inventory control system to provide them with those reporting and compliance requirements that's unique to the foreign trade zone program. Secondly is looking at your procedures, making sure your procedures encompass everything about your manufacturing process. From the goods coming into the zone, the goods being manufactured into different parts, which gives them different tariff classifications, and then also those goods that are going to eventually become finished product and leave the zone. Sometimes there's outside processing where temporary removals are required, or there's specialty things that need to be done to that product, like heat treatment or other different things. So making sure you have effective procedures in place that encompass every nuance of your manufacturing process is key to that program. And then a positive relationship with Customs. I think, as you could see, the group of us up here have a positive relationship with Customs, and keeping that ongoing is key to the success of your program. Using Customs as a resource, they're not the bad guy. They're not the ones that are going to give you the bad news unless you don't have that relationship, unless you haven't kept that ongoing relationship. I'm sure Officer Jones and Officer Walker hate seeing my phone number pop up. I call them a lot because I have unique situations, but I would much rather call them. I'd much rather an operator call them and ask that extra question than assume that they're doing it right when it turns out they're doing it wrong. So again, that building that strong relationship with Customs is key to this program for it to be successful. And then prioritize compliance. Many companies will look at compliance as a secondary or tertiary priority. In my opinion, and I think many FTZ operators, compliance has to be the priority above all, is being in compliance with U.S. Customs and the other government agencies that may come into play with your product in managing your zone, especially with manufacturing, because many times manufacturing does include other government agencies such as TTB, FDA, and so on, EPA in some cases. And then communicate with your FTZ team. Your FTZ team is your in-house FTZ team with compliance, management, and your executives. And then it's also working directly with your consultants, with your grantee, and with U.S. Customs. Any other resources that you may have, which is your customs broker, your freight forwarders, making sure your supply chain is in tune with what you're trying to do in the foreign trade zone to make this successful. But communication and building those relationships throughout your supply chain to help you manage your manufacturing facility, in my opinion, is extremely key to a successful program. And that's it. So this was a little bit shorter than the last one, hopefully.
Okay, questions from the audience?
Sure.
Yeah, if it's wrong, so if somebody else does a 214 and they haven't done it correctly, and the process is going through, and I presume it's okay, I say, well, it's 214, it's ready for entry in my foreign trade zone. There are steps that are missing or components. 14 we had in question, had no permit to transfer, they had no FDA approval at all. They hadn't done several steps along the way, and yet they had somehow forced this 214 through an electronic system. So we thought it was okay, right? It wasn't until David checked it out, he said, well, why did it reject it? Said, that answer your question?
No, but what if you follow 214?
Well, let me clarify something. In the FTZ world, there's three basic parties: the grantee, the operator, and possibly the user or tenant. The grantee authorizes the operator to operate the FTZ. The FTZ operator is either the importer of record or just the operator of the foreign trade zone. The client or tenant is someone who contracts with the FTZ operator to use the FTZ and their services. So if the importer is a client or user of the FTZ, they're using the FTZ to import their product. They haven't made entry. It's not a cleared merchandise. It still hasn't, duties haven't been paid, so it's still considered bonded merchandise, customs bonded merchandise. If the FTZ operator accepts the merchandise into their foreign trade zone, they're taking responsibility for that merchandise, which is why U.S. Customs and Border Protection holds the operator responsible for that merchandise.
Other questions?
I have one thing to say. If your company is considering to become a foreign trade zone, I would highly recommend that you consider applying for CTPAT status. In the application process, it doesn't make much difference because we take them in first come, first served basis. But where it really makes a difference is when we go to the compliance portion of what Customs does. We take into account CTPAT and chain supply security, and we look at it very seriously. If you're a CTPAT member, we will take that in consideration before we write up any liquidated damages or penalties.
Also adds another layer of security.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
definitely. We know that your supply chain is secure. So it's been vetted and it's been looked at extensively. And so if your supply chain is, and your company is a CTPAT member, I would highly recommend that you, or they're not, I would recommend that you look into it if it's economically feasible.
If you do want to sign up for CTPAT, go to cbp.gov, go to the trade page, look up CTPAT. It'll show you what's needed to apply, the supply chain security standards, and then you gain access to the CTPAT portal. And that's how you sign up. There's an 800 number you can call, and people will help you with the application. It doesn't cost you anything of your time.
One thing that you also find is that the CTPAT process has a lot to do with security of your supply chain and procedures, which falls is very similar to what you're doing in the foreign trade zone. It's about security and procedures. And correct me if I'm wrong, Supervisor, but isn't a foreign trade zone operator make you best practices for CTPAT, and so that there is some similarities there?
Get it tier 3. Yeah.
Yes, very similar, very similar. When I look at, my buddy, we started out in enforcement together 20 years ago, is now in charge of CTPAT in LA. So, yeah, I've taken a look at what they review and our security procedures that we review here, and they're quite similar. You know, as far as facilities security, and
I believe so, that 3PLs qualify for CTPAT.
yes.
I'm like 90% certain, and you can verify it at cbp.gov. It'll tell you what parties are eligible to apply. No, they were added later. Originally, it was just for importers, and then it's been expanded since then.
And I think FTZ operators and 3PLs were one of the last entities to be added to have access to become a CTPAT member, but they're allowed now.
Yeah. Okay, we'll go ladies first, and the gentleman up front.
Okay, well, if a shipment is, usually what happens is those shipments are usually discovered based on a hold. Agriculture will place a hold, do an examination. At that point, they require fumigation for wood packing or something like, or FDA exam or something, or agricultural exam. That's done through the hold process and the targeting process. If something is in an FTZ, it's very rare that it's going to have an agriculture hold on it. Usually it's already been cleared. And it's usually going to, if it's going to go to an FTZ, it's going to be examined before it gets there. So,
One unique situation, though, is there's actually a foreign trade zone down in San Diego that's a cold storage unit, and they have USDA on site regularly to do USDA inspections because they do a lot of meat products. And so they're able to capitalize on having that USDA inspection on site, as well as being a foreign trade zone, to be able to have goods, especially coming from Canada and coming from abroad, that are able to go through the foreign trade zone, because everything moves in bond, but it's still subject to meeting the public health requirements through FDA and USDA. So they're still adhering to that before it exports. In this case, for this company, many of their product export into Mexico. So I think it's a very unique circumstances when you see those combinations, and there are a lot of other government agencies that get involved in that process that you have to adhere to as well.
yeah, I believe there's one cold storage facility here in LA that's a foreign trade zone.
Oh, is there? Oh, great,
yeah.
great.
And if the agricultural products, if you have to destroy them because they're got mold or they've spoiled or whatever the case may be, there's the opportunity, if you've already paid duty on them, to get your money cheerfully refunded.
Those, I'd go out on a limb and say probably during the activation process, those are the commodities that would get, brought to your attention. You'd probably be hesitant to approve a direct delivery program for that kind of stuff, right?
Well, not necessarily.
Okay.
It's maybe a good candidate for it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perishable goods are treated a little differently than your regular general classification merchandise. We're aware that if we make it sit at the dock for a week, mangoes will not be the same mangoes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we had a question from the gentleman there.
sorry, if you could repeat that again?
The charges, you think?
Well, the third party, the 3PL FTZ has to present their rates to the grantee as part of the requirement. And then secondly, foreign trade zone operators shouldn't be raising their rates just because they're a foreign trade zone. They're not allowed to do that. So they may have some administrative fees related to the foreign trade zone, but the handling in and the storage rates and the handling out should be typical of any business. There shouldn't be any exploiting that just because you're a foreign trade zone. And so that's a process that the grantee works with those 3PL office operators to go through. But there are administrative fees and additional fees that may apply due to extra documentation concerns and so forth like that we do see. But again, I think that's something you work directly with that 3PL operator to negotiate rates, and is what we've seen in the past.
And the rates are not regulated, so.
But I believe there's a ceiling for those rates that you establish at the time of activating. Yes. I mean, we can always, talk on the side. I can give you some examples, or even talk to a general purpose operator right here, as far as what those rates may look like. But again, it's not a standard for all 3PLs to use the same rates. They use their own competitive rates. Oh. I don't think there's a common, I think the common principle is probably by cartons or pallet is what you see, but then when you deal with certain other commodities like raw metals, it's going to be by weight. Depending on the commodity, there's probably going to be a difference on what unit of measure is used, but I think the most common one is either cartons or pallets.
Other questions? Okay, at this point, I think there's some thank yous in order, and we have a question in the front row first.
When you last stated that you would get a refund on this,
Yeah.
you said refund, is refund a drawback or?
That'd be one way of doing it. There's, under certain circumstances, for goods that have been abandoned after entry, you can get a refund. Okay. That's in part 151 of the regs, I think. Okay. Okay. So, first of all, thank you. Let's give some thank yous to our panelists. I think the value of the information you got today was worth way more than the admission price. So good information, guys. And secondly, I want to thank Gilberto and the Port of Long Beach folks for helping organize this and lending us this great facility. So thank you much. And finally, I want to thank all of you for coming today. We appreciate your attendance. We appreciate any feedback that you give and the questions you asked today. Thank you all for coming, and have a safe trip home, and let's hope the freeway is kind to you.